The morning air inside the Ashford Grand Hotel always carried a quiet kind of elegance. Soft, controlled, and almost too composed, like a place that had learned how to hold its breath for generations. Sunlight slipped through the tall glass windows and stretched across the marble floors in long golden lines, illuminating chandeliers that had witnessed decades of whispered conversations, silent negotiations, and decisions that changed lives, without ever raising a voice. From the outside, the hotel looked untouchable, timeless, powerful. But inside the private penthouse suite overlooking the courtyard, a woman stood at a kitchen counter, wiping the same corner for the second time. Not because it was dirty, not because it needed cleaning, but because that exact spot once held letters she had spent years waiting for. Letters that rarely came, and apologies that never sounded the way she needed them to. Scarlett paused, mid-motion. The dishcloth hovered in her hand, as the quiet hum of the hotel's morning operations drifted faintly upward from 3 floors below. Rolling suitcases, soft footsteps, polite greetings. A world moving forward without hesitation. And yet, she stood still. Because no matter how much her life had changed, her habits had not. $500 million. That was the official valuation of the Ashford Grand Hotel. $500 million. In marble, legacy, reputation, and generational power. And legally, undeniably, it now belonged to her. Scarlett, not born into wealth, not raised in luxury, not conditioned for inheritance. Just a woman who once worked late shifts behind the very front desk, now engraved with her name on internal ownership documents. Her hotel. Even thinking the words felt unnatural, like trying to wear a title that had not been emotionally tailored to fit her identity. Outside, the fountain in the courtyard continued its steady rhythm, water cascading in a controlled loop, predictable, elegant, and calm. Control. That word had, quietly, become the invisible theme of her life. Scarlett exhaled slowly and folded the cloth with mechanical precision, her movements neat, deliberate, and practiced. The kind of movements people develop when their inner world feels uncertain, but their environment demands composure. Educational truth she had learned too late. People who grow up in emotionally unpredictable environments often create physical routines to feel safe. And she was no exception. Her fingers returned to the same corner of the counter. One more wipe. Gentle, careful, almost symbolic. Behind her, the city skyline shimmered in the distance, but her focus drifted inward, to a memory she had replayed so many times that it no longer felt like a single event, but a slow psychological shift. The day the will was read. The lawyer's voice had been calm, professional, detached, as per the final wishes of Mrs. Eleanor Ashford. Full ownership of the Ashford Grand Hotel and its associated assets is hereby transferred to Scarlett Hayes. Silence had followed. Not shocked silence, not joyful silence, but a silence thick enough to feel strategic. Scarlett remembered the exact sensation in her chest at that moment. Not excitement, not pride, but something closer to emotional vertigo. Because deep down, she had never associated receiving something valuable with feeling secure. To her, receiving something big always meant one thing. Something equally big would eventually be taken away. That belief had not come from wealth. It had come from childhood, from promises that changed, from affection that depended on performance, from a home where emotional stability was conditional, not guaranteed. And psychological research often confirms a quiet truth. When someone grows up with conditional emotional support, unexpected success can feel more threatening than comforting. Scarlett didn't celebrate that day. She observed, she listened, and, most importantly, she watched the 2 people sitting closest to her. Her husband, Harrison, and mother-in-law, Margaret Ashford. Harrison had gone completely still when the inheritance was announced. Not reactive, not expressive, just silent. At the time, she interpreted that silence as shock. Weeks later, her memory reshaped it into hesitation. And months later, fear distorted it further into something more dangerous. Complicity. Margaret, on the other hand, had smiled. Not warmly, not proudly, but with the kind of restrained composure that belonged to someone whose mind was already 10 steps ahead of the room. "You must understand," Margaret had said days later, in a voice polished by decades of social influence. "Assets of this magnitude require experienced oversight." Experienced oversight. Such a polite phrase. Such a strategic phrase. Such a psychologically powerful phrase. Because, depending on emotional perspective, it could mean support or control. Scarlett rinsed the cloth and placed it neatly beside the sink, her reflection faintly visible in the glass cabinet ahead of her. She studied herself for a brief second. Same posture, same careful composure, same quiet alertness. Wealth had changed her environment, but it had not yet changed her internal narrative. From the hallway, faint footsteps approached. Measured, familiar, unhurried. "You're wiping the same corner again," Harrison's voice said, gently from the doorway. Scarlett didn't turn immediately. "I know," she replied softly. The air between them carried no hostility, but it carried history. And history, she was slowly learning, was one of the most powerful psychological forces in any relationship. Harrison leaned against the frame, his presence calm but observant, the same way he had always watched her, even years ago when she stood behind the front desk in a neatly pressed uniform, nervous about making mistakes. Back then, he had been a billionaire heir, checking into a hotel. Now he was the husband of the woman who owned it. A shift neither of them had emotionally processed fast enough. "It used to be where the mail was kept," Scarlett added quietly, as if explaining a behavior she herself had only recently begun to understand. Harrison nodded. "Your mother used to leave notes there." Scarlett blinked and turned slightly. "You remember that?" "I remember things that made you pause," he said. And that was the moment. Something subtle tightened in her chest. Because that was exactly how their relationship had started. Not with attraction, not with grand romance, but emotional observation. Years ago, on a quiet midnight shift, he had looked at her and said something no one else had ever noticed. "You look like someone who listens more than she speaks." Not beautiful, not charming, not impressive, understood. And psychologically, being understood is often more emotionally bonding than being admired. Scarlett rested her palm lightly on the counter and stared at the courtyard below. The fountain continued its endless loop. Guests walked in and out. Life moved forward, but inside her, a quieter question lingered. One she had avoided asking directly for months. Not because she feared conflict, but because she feared confirmation. Because if her perception was correct, then the people closest to her had not celebrated her inheritance. They had adjusted to it, strategized around it, and possibly, quietly, planned how to manage it, or manage her. Educational life insight. Sometimes betrayal does not begin with confrontation. It begins with subtle shifts in behavior, language, and emotional distance. Scarlett inhaled slowly. "I've been thinking," she said. Harrison didn't interrupt. A habit of his, a strength, and sometimes a source of misunderstanding. "About the day I inherited the hotel." For the first time that morning, the atmosphere inside the penthouse changed. Not dramatically, not loudly, but perceptibly. Because some conversations don't raise voices. They raise truth. And truth, once spoken, has a way of revealing whether love was built on understanding or silent assumptions. The silence that followed Scarlett's words did not feel hostile. It felt careful, like the kind of silence two people create when they both understand that what comes next is not just a conversation, but a quiet excavation of memories they have avoided touching for too long. Harrison didn't move from the doorway. He didn't interrupt. He didn't defend. He didn't redirect the topic. He simply watched her the way he always had, attentively, patiently, and with a restraint that once felt safe to Scarlett, but had slowly begun to feel distant. "I've been thinking about it too," he said at last. His voice was calm, but there was weight beneath it. Scarlett turned slightly, leaning her hip against the counter, as sunlight shifted across the marble floor. The atmosphere in the penthouse remained elegant, quiet, composed, yet emotionally heavier than the grand lobby 3 floors below. Because while the hotel functioned on structure and protocol, their marriage functioned on interpretation. And interpretation, she was beginning to understand, could be dangerously shaped by memory. "When the lawyer said my name," Scarlett continued slowly, "I didn't feel happy." Harrison's brow furrowed slightly, not in disagreement, but in curiosity. "I felt exposed," she admitted. That word lingered in the air. Exposed, not empowered, not honored, not lucky. Exposed. Educational insight. People with a history of emotional uncertainty often interpret sudden success as vulnerability rather than security. Scarlett's fingers lightly traced the edge of the countertop as her thoughts drifted backward again, not just to the will reading, but to the weeks that followed. The phone calls, the meetings, the documents, the polite language, the subtle emotional shift in the household. At first, everything sounded supportive, she said. Advice, suggestions, strategic conversations. Harrison remained quiet. But over time, she continued, those conversations started sounding less like support and more like preparation. Preparation for? He asked, gently. Scarlett looked at him fully now. For a version of my life where I wasn't the one in control of what I had been given. The honesty in her voice was not accusatory. It was reflective. And reflection, unlike accusation, invites understanding rather than defensiveness. Harrison exhaled slowly, as if absorbing not just her words, but the emotional timeline behind them. "My grandmother trusted you," he said. "That never changed." Scarlett gave a faint, almost thoughtful smile. "I know she did." She paused. "But trust from the person who gave me the hotel felt very different from the reactions of the people who were supposed to stand beside me after I received it. That distinction was subtle, yet psychologically significant, because emotional safety is not determined by who gives us something. It is determined by how the people closest to us respond when our life changes. Scarlett walked toward the window again, her gaze drifting over the courtyard fountain that never stopped flowing, never hesitated, never questioned its own direction. Unlike her, "Do you remember what your mother said 2 weeks after the will?" she asked quietly. Harrison didn't answer immediately, which, ironically, was exactly what she expected. "She said," Scarlett continued, her voice calm but precise, "assets of this magnitude require experienced oversight." The words echoed in the room with the same polished tone Margaret had used months ago. "At the time," Scarlett added, "I heard something very different from what was said." "What did you hear?" Harrison asked. Scarlett's expression softened, not with anger, but with self-awareness. "I heard you are not capable." Harrison straightened slightly. "That was never what she meant." "I know that now," Scarlett replied. And that sentence alone revealed growth. Because emotional maturity often begins when a person separates past interpretation from present understanding. "But back then," she continued, "my mind didn't process it as guidance. It processed it as doubt." She folded her arms gently, not defensively, but thoughtfully. Educational life lesson. Our past emotional experiences often act as a filter, changing how we interpret neutral or even supportive statements. Scarlett's childhood had quietly trained her to expect loss after gain. Not because she was pessimistic, but because that had been her lived pattern. Unexpected praise, followed by criticism. Unexpected gifts, followed by emotional withdrawal. Unexpected stability, followed by sudden change. So when she inherited something massive, permanent, and valuable, her nervous system did not interpret it as security. It interpreted it as temporary. And then the meeting started, she said softly. Harrison's jaw tightened slightly, not in anger, in recognition. Lawyers, Scarlett continued, advisors, financial consultants, risk assessments, ownership structure discussions. They were standard procedures, Harrison said carefully. Yes, Scarlett agreed. She paused. But emotional reactions to standard procedures are not always standard. That sentence hung in the room with quiet intelligence, because it was true. To someone raised in generational wealth, legal structuring might feel routine. To someone raised in emotional instability, it could feel like the beginning of loss. Scarlett turned back toward the counter and rested her palm against it, grounding herself in the present moment. I remember sitting at that long conference table, she said, listening to professionals talk about the hotel like it was a strategic asset. It is a strategic asset, Harrison replied gently. She nodded. Yes, but to me, it was also something else. What? He asked. She met his gaze. Proof that someone saw value in me, beyond my role, my background, or my financial status. That realization shifted the emotional tone of the conversation, because now the inheritance was no longer just about money. It was about identity, educational value. Sometimes what people protect is not the asset itself, but the emotional meaning attached to it. Scarlett inhaled slowly. When restructuring proposals started appearing, she continued, my mind didn't see collaboration. It saw a slow rewriting of ownership. Harrison stepped further into the room now, no longer just an observer. You never asked me directly what I thought, he said quietly. Scarlett didn't deny it. Instead, she answered with honesty. Because I was afraid of the answer. That was the truth she had not said out loud for months. Fear of confirmation often leads to emotional silence. And emotional silence, over time, creates psychological distance, even in loving relationships. I thought, she admitted, if I asked, and you agreed with the restructuring, it would confirm my deepest fear. And fear was, Harrison asked. Scarlett's voice softened, almost to a whisper, that receiving something valuable automatically makes people around you reconsider your place in their lives. The room grew still again. Not tense, not cold, just deeply reflective. Harrison ran a hand slowly through his hair, a rare sign that he was processing something emotionally rather than strategically. Scarlett, he said, I married you when you were working double shifts at the front desk. She blinked. I know. I married you before the inheritance, before the ownership, before any legal documents existed, he continued. His tone was not defensive. It was grounding. That never changed. Scarlett studied his expression carefully, because another educational truth was quietly revealing itself. Consistency in behavior is often a stronger indicator of intention than silence in moments of change. Yet her memory had reshaped his silence into something heavier. Not because he had betrayed her, but because her fear had filled the emotional gaps. And you, she asked gently, what did you feel that day? Harrison didn't answer immediately, but this time, his silence felt different, less distant, more honest. I felt conflicted, he admitted. Scarlett's chest tightened slightly, but she didn't interrupt. Not because I didn't trust you, he clarified, But because that hotel has been in my family for 4 generations. He walked toward the window, standing beside her, but not too close. I grew up hearing stories about it, watching my grandmother protect it, seeing it treated as more than a business. He paused. It was history, legacy, identity. Scarlett listened quietly, and when it was suddenly transferred, he continued. My first reaction wasn't financial. What was it? She asked. He looked at the fountain below. Fear of losing something that represented my family's emotional foundation. That answer reframed everything. Not greed, not strategy, not conspiracy. Fear. Educational life lesson. Different people can react to the same event based on entirely different emotional motivations. Scarlett closed her eyes briefly, because for the first time, she was beginning to see a possibility she had not fully considered before. What if no one was trying to steal from her? What if they were reacting from their own psychological conditioning? And what if her interpretation had been shaped less by reality, more by memory? Behind her, the kitchen remained quiet. The counter remained clean. And for the first time since the inheritance, Scarlett realized something profound. The real conflict may not have started with legal documents or family discussions. It may have started inside her mind. The moment she believed that receiving something extraordinary meant preparing to defend it, even from the people who loved her most. If you've ever felt like your life changed, and the people around you changed with it, take a moment and share your experience in the comments. Your story might help someone else feel less alone. And if you believe that love, trust, and emotional growth are lessons worth learning through storytelling, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to Love Stories by Mr. Johnson, and turn on notifications so you never miss a story that speaks to the heart. Years before the inheritance, before the legal meetings, before silence became something heavy between them, the Ashford Grand Hotel had been simply a workplace to Scarlett. Not a legacy, not a symbol, not a battlefield of perception and fear. Just a place where she clocked in, stood behind a polished front desk, and focused on doing her job correctly. That night had been unusually quiet. The kind of quiet that only expensive hotels could afford. Soft lighting, distant elevator chimes, and the faint scent of polished wood and fresh linen lingering in the air. Outside, a light rain traced delicate patterns against the tall glass windows, blurring the city lights into gentle streaks of gold and silver. Scarlett adjusted the stack of reservation files for the 3rd time, not because they were disorganized, but because order gave her a sense of control. Educational truth. People who grow up in emotionally uncertain environments often become highly detail-oriented as adults. Structure becomes their silent coping mechanism. It was past midnight. Most guests had already checked in. The lobby, usually filled with movement and polite conversations, now felt like a calm pause between 2 chapters of a long, ongoing story. She preferred these hours. Less noise, less pressure, fewer unpredictable interactions, and fewer moments where she had to guess what people truly meant behind their words. Scarlett glanced at the clock. 12:17 a.m. The rain outside intensified slightly, tapping softly against the glass like a quiet reminder that the world never fully slept, even when it appeared still. Then the revolving doors turned. Not hurriedly, not dramatically, but with a smooth, measured motion of someone accustomed to environments where everything functioned efficiently. A tall man stepped into the lobby, removing his coat as he crossed the marble floor. He didn't look around in awe the way most first-time guests did. He didn't check his phone anxiously. He didn't carry the restless energy of someone in a rush. Instead, he moved with quiet observation. Harrison. At the time, she didn't know his name, only that there was something different about the way he entered the space. Not entitled, not distracted, just attentive in a way that was rare among guests of his status. Scarlett straightened slightly behind the desk, her professional composure settling into place like a well-practiced habit. "Good evening," she said politely. "Welcome To the Ashford Grand. Her tone was warm, but measured, friendly, but not overly familiar. Another learned behavior, because growing up had taught her that emotional distance often protected her from disappointment. The man approached the desk and offered a small, respectful nod. Reservation under Harrison Ashford. The surname meant something. Even then, employees were trained to recognize it. The Ashford family name carried influence throughout the hotel, though Scarlett had never personally met any of them before that night. She quickly checked the system, her fingers moving with quiet efficiency. "Yes, Mr. Ashford. Your suite is prepared." She handed him the keycard, expecting the usual brief exchange that came with late-night check-ins. But instead of immediately leaving, he paused. Not in impatience, in observation. His gaze drifted, not in a scrutinizing way, but in a thoughtful one, toward the way she aligned the edge of the registration documents perfectly parallel to the desk. Then he spoke. "You organize things, even when they're already organized." Scarlett blinked. The comment wasn't rude. It wasn't flirtatious. It wasn't even judgmental. It was observant. "I like things to feel settled," she replied carefully. He tilted his head slightly, as if considering the deeper meaning behind that sentence. "That usually means you don't trust chaos," he said. The accuracy of that statement caught her off guard more than she expected. Most guests noticed the luxury of the hotel, the decor, the service, the prestige, not the small behavioral patterns of the person behind the desk. She hesitated for half a second before responding. "Chaos tends to come unannounced." A faint expression, something close to understanding, passed across his face. Then came the sentence that would remain in her memory for years. "You look like someone who listens more than she speaks. Not beautiful, not charming, not impressive. Just understood." And psychologically, being understood creates a deeper emotional imprint than surface-level compliments. Scarlett felt something unfamiliar loosen inside her chest. Not attraction, not excitement. Relief. A quiet, unexpected relief that came from being seen without needing to explain herself. "That's an unusual observation for a first interaction," she said, regaining her professional composure. Harrison gave a slight shrug. "Most people talk to be heard," he replied calmly. "You seem like someone who observes first." Educational insight. Emotionally perceptive individuals often form deeper connections through recognition rather than charm. Scarlett handed him the final document. "Elevators are to your right. Breakfast service begins at 6. He accepted the card, but didn't immediately walk away. Instead, he glanced briefly at the rain-streaked windows. "Do you always work this late?" "Most nights," she answered. "By choice?" That question lingered longer than the others. Scarlett considered her response carefully. "Yes," she said. "Late hours are quieter. Predictable." Harrison nodded slowly. Predictability feels safe. It wasn't phrased as a question. It was a statement. That was the moment she realized something important about him. He didn't fill silence with unnecessary conversation. He respected it. Another rare trait. "Good night, Mr. Ashford," she said gently, but as he turned to leave, he paused once more. "Scarlett," he said, reading her name tag. She looked up. "You don't have to earn the right to exist quietly," he added. Then he walked toward the elevators. No dramatic smile, no lingering glance, no romantic gesture. Just a simple sentence, delivered with calm sincerity. And yet, that sentence stayed with her long after his footsteps disappeared into the elevator corridor. Educational life lesson. Sometimes the most impactful connections begin not with attraction, but with emotional validation. The lobby returned to its quiet state. The rain softened. The clock continued its steady ticking. But Scarlett found herself standing still behind the desk, replaying the interaction in her mind, not because it was romantic, but because it was emotionally precise. For someone who had spent most of her life feeling misunderstood, that kind of recognition felt unfamiliar, and unfamiliar comfort can be more powerful than familiar admiration. She glanced down at the neatly aligned documents again. Then, almost unconsciously, she adjusted them once more. Not because they needed adjustment, but because her internal world had shifted slightly, and her routine was trying to catch up with the emotional change. Upstairs, in a suite that overlooked the same courtyard she would one day own, Harrison Ashford stood near the window, observing the rain in thoughtful silence. He had met countless people in his life. Executives, investors, social elites, but very few who carried quiet emotional depth beneath professional composure, and even fewer who listened more than they spoke. He didn't know then that the woman behind the desk would one day inherit the very hotel his family had built. He didn't know she become his wife. And he certainly didn't know that years later, silence between them would be misinterpreted as something far more dangerous than it ever was. But that night planted something subtle. Not romance, not attachment, recognition. And educational psychology suggests that recognition-based bonds often develop into the most emotionally resilient relationships because they are built on understanding rather than illusion. Back at the front desk, Scarlett resumed her duties. Yet something about the atmosphere felt different now. Not louder, not brighter, just slightly warmer. And for the first time in a long while, the quiet no longer felt empty. It felt shared. The rain had stopped by the time Scarlett's shift ended. Dawn approached slowly, stretching pale light across the quiet streets outside the Ashford Grand Hotel. The city was waking, but the hotel still existed in that delicate space between night and morning, calm, controlled, and emotionally neutral. Scarlett preferred that hour. Transitions felt honest, not forced, not performative, just gradual. She gathered her things carefully, smoothing the edges of her uniform sleeves, as she always did before leaving. Another small habit, another quiet attempt to leave every environment exactly as she found it. Predictable, orderly, safe. But as she stepped out from behind the front desk, her mind drifted back to the brief conversation from earlier. You look like someone who listens more than she speaks. It wasn't the kind of sentence most people remembered. Yet, she did, because it had not been spoken to impress her. It had been spoken to understand her. Educational insight, words rooted in observation, often create deeper emotional impact than words rooted in admiration. Scarlett walked toward the staff exit corridor, but as she passed the lobby seating area, she noticed something unexpected. Harrison was still there, seated near the window. Not working, not on a call, not distracted, just watching the courtyard fountain as early morning light reflected off the water. That was unusual. Guests of his status rarely lingered in public hotel spaces, especially not in silence. She hesitated briefly, unsure whether to acknowledge him. Professional boundaries mattered to her. They always had. But before she could continue walking, his voice reached her, calm, measured, and familiar. You're off shift now. It wasn't phrased as a question. Scarlett turned slightly. Yes, he nodded, as if confirming something internally. You walk differently when you're not working. That observation caught her off guard again. How? She asked before she could stop herself. Less guarded, he replied simply. Scarlett felt a subtle tension in her chest. Not discomfort, but awareness. Because he wasn't making assumptions. He was noticing patterns. And being seen that clearly could feel both comforting and unsettling at the same time. Educational life lesson. Emotional awareness in others can feel intrusive if a person is used to protecting their inner world. I suppose everyone relaxes when their responsibilities end, she said carefully. Harrison tilted his head slightly. Not everyone, he replied. Some people carry their responsibilities internally, even when their shift is over. The accuracy of that statement lingered. Scarlett didn't respond immediately. Instead, she glanced toward the window. I like routines, she admitted quietly. They make things easier to manage. Manage what? He asked. The question was gentle, not invasive, but direct. Scarlett considered her answer longer this time. Expectations, she finally said. That single word revealed more than she intended, because expectations had shaped most of her life. Expectations to perform, to adapt, to remain composed, and most importantly, to never assume stability would last. Harrison leaned back slightly in his chair, his expression thoughtful rather than analytical. Do you always assume things will change? He asked. Scarlett gave a small, restrained smile. I assume they might. That distinction mattered. She was not pessimistic. She was prepared. Educational value. People raised in uncertain emotional environments often develop anticipation-based thinking as a form of self-protection. Silence settled between them again. But unlike awkward silence, this one felt intentional. Comfortable, almost reflective. You've worked here long? Harrison asked. After a moment. 3 years, she replied. And you like it? Scarlett looked around the lobby, the polished floors, the quiet elegance, the predictable structure. Yes, she said honestly. It's stable. He followed her gaze. My grandmother used to say this hotel remembers people, he said. Scarlett blinked. That's an interesting way to describe a building. She believed spaces absorb energy, he continued. Conversations, decisions, emotions. Scarlett considered that. Then her eyes drifted toward the front desk. That would mean it remembers a lot of quiet conversations, she said softly. Harrison nodded. And quiet people. Their conversation was not romantic. It was not dramatic. It was something far rarer, emotionally grounded. Educational insight. Healthy emotional bonds often develop through calm consistency, not intensity. Scarlett shifted her bag slightly on her shoulder. You should probably get some rest, she said politely. It's been a long night. I could say the same to you, he replied. She gave a faint nod, then turned to leave. But his next words stopped her. Scarlett, she looked back. You don't seem impressed by wealth, he said. The statement was unexpected. I work in a luxury hotel, she answered calmly. Exposure reduces fascination. He studied her expression carefully. And does it reduce intimidation? Scarlett paused. That question reached deeper than he likely intended, because intimidation had never come from wealth itself. It had come from unpredictability. Intimidation comes from behavior, not status, she said. Harrison's expression shifted slightly. Subtle respect, replacing simple curiosity. That's a rare perspective. Or a practical one, she replied. Educational life lesson. Emotional maturity often shows in how a person evaluates power, not by appearance, but by behavior. Days passed, then weeks. Their interactions remained occasional, brief, and unforced. He never lingered excessively, never crossed professional boundaries, never used charm as a tool. Instead, their connection developed through small, consistent moments. A quiet greeting, a thoughtful observation, a respectful exchange. And psychologically, consistency builds trust more effectively than grand gestures. Scarlett began noticing something else, too. Harrison asked questions that focused on how she thought, not how she appeared. What do you notice most during night shifts? What makes a place feel emotionally safe? Do you prefer predictable routines or flexible environments? Questions like those did not feel intrusive. They felt tentative. One evening, during a quieter shift, he approached the desk again. "You reorganized the guest logs," he said. "Yes," Scarlett replied. "It improves efficiency. You solve problems before they become visible." She hesitated slightly. "That's part of a job." He shook his head gently. "No, that's part of your personality." That statement lingered longer than any compliment ever could, because it acknowledged effort, not surface traits. Educational insight. Recognition of effort creates deeper emotional trust than praise of appearance. Over time, Scarlett found herself feeling something unfamiliar in his presence. Not excitement, not nervousness, relief. The relief of not needing to perform emotionally. The relief of being seen as she was, rather than who she was expected to be. And for someone who had spent years navigating conditional emotional environments, that kind of relief was powerful. One night, as she finalized a late check-in, Harrison spoke again, calm as always. "Most people try to impress those they meet." Scarlett glanced up. "And don't? Some prefer to understand instead," he said. She held his gaze for a brief second. "And which are you?" A small pause followed. Then he answered honestly, "I prefer understanding. It lasts longer." That sentence stayed with her long after the conversation ended, because deep down, Scarlett was beginning to realize something important. Her connection with Harrison was not built on attraction. It was built on emotional recognition. And educational psychology confirms, relationships built on emotional understanding tend to be more stable than those built solely on admiration or excitement. Months later, when he finally asked her to have coffee outside of work, the invitation was simple. No dramatic tone, no persuasive charm, just calm sincerity. "I'd like to continue our conversations somewhere less formal," he said. Scarlett hesitated, not because she doubted him, but because accepting emotional closeness had always felt riskier than maintaining polite distance. Yet something about his consistency felt safe, predictable, respectful, and for the first time in years, her decision was not driven by fear of future disappointment. It was guided by present, emotional clarity. "Yes," she said quietly, and that single word marked the beginning of a relationship that would later be tested not by lack of love, but by misinterpretation, silence, and the psychological weight of sudden power and inheritance. Because neither of them knew then that the hotel, the same place where their quiet bond began, would one day become the very thing that challenged their trust, their communication, and their understanding of each other's true intentions. The first time Scarlett was invited into the private wing of the Ashford Grand Hotel, she noticed something immediately. The silence there felt different. Not empty, not lonely, but deliberate. Like every wall, every portrait, and every polished surface carried the quiet weight of history. Unlike the public lobby, where elegance was designed for guests, the private wing was designed for legacy. The lighting was softer, the hallways wider, and the air held a stillness that suggested decisions had been made there long before she ever stepped inside. Scarlett walked beside Harrison with careful composure, her heels echoing faintly against the marble floor. She had visited nearly every part of the hotel as an employee. But this space belonged to the Ashford family, and psychologically, Environments tied to generational power often create an unspoken emotional pressure on outsiders, even when they are welcomed. "You're quiet," Harrison observed gently. "I'm observing," Scarlett replied. He gave a faint nod, as if that response aligned perfectly with what he already knew about her. "That's what you always do first." She glanced at the portraits lining the hallway, past owners, founders, and matriarchs, whose presence still lingered through oil paint and gold frames. "Your family built all of this," she said softly. "My great-grandfather started it," Harrison replied. "But my grandmother preserved it." That distinction was important. Scarlett noticed it immediately. Educational insight. There is a psychological difference between building something and preserving it. Builders focus on growth. Preservers focus on protection. "And she still manages everything?" Scarlett asked. Harrison's expression shifted slightly. "She manages the philosophy behind it." That answer intrigued her, because philosophy suggested something deeper than business. They stopped in front of a large set of double doors. Harrison opened them slowly. Inside sat Eleanor Ashford, his grandmother, the woman whose presence felt less like authority and more like quiet gravity. She wasn't surrounded by assistants. She wasn't reviewing documents. She wasn't issuing commands. Instead, she sat near the window, overlooking the courtyard fountain, reading a leather-bound book as sunlight filtered softly across the room. Scarlett's first impression was unexpected. Not intimidating, not cold, but observant. The kind of observant that saw beyond appearances. Eleanor closed her book gently as they entered. "Show," she said calmly, her voice soft yet precise. "You're the one who listens more than she speaks." Scarlett blinked, then glanced briefly at Harrison. He didn't deny it, which meant he had spoken about her. "Yes, ma'am," Scarlett replied respectfully. Eleanor studied her for a few seconds. Not in judgment, but in assessment. And assessment, when done quietly, often reveals more than direct questioning. "You stand differently in here," Eleanor said. Scarlett hesitated. "How so?" "Carefully," Eleanor replied. "As if you're aware this space carries history." Scarlett gave a small, honest nod. "Does a faint smile touched Eleanor's lips. Good. Awareness is rarer than confidence. Educational value? True leadership often begins with awareness, not dominance." Harrison remained silent during the exchange. Not distant, just respectful of the dynamic unfolding. "Sit," Eleanor gestured. Scarlett obeyed, folding her hands neatly in her lap, her posture composed but not rigid. Eleanor leaned back slightly, her gaze thoughtful. "Harrison tells me you prefer night shifts." "I do," Scarlett answered. "Why is that?" Scarlett paused, considering the most honest version of her truth. "They're quieter, more predictable, easier to manage emotionally." Eleanor's eyes sharpened slightly. Emotionally, Scarlett realized she had revealed more than intended. But instead of retracting, she clarified, less chaos means fewer unexpected emotional demands. Silence followed. Not awkward, evaluative. Then Eleanor nodded once. "That is a remarkably self-aware answer." Educational insight, emotional intelligence, is often revealed through how a person describes their preferences, not their achievements. Eleanor turned her attention toward the courtyard fountain outside. "This hotel," she said slowly, "has hosted presidents, celebrities, and investors." She paused. "But the people it remembers most are not the powerful ones." Scarlett listened carefully. "It remembers the consistent ones," Eleanor continued. The ones who show up with integrity, not performance. Scarlett felt something shift internally, because for the first time, someone of immense influence was not evaluating her status. They were evaluating her character. "I've observed you," Eleanor added calmly. Scarlett's heartbeat slowed slightly. From a distance, Eleanor clarified, "Not through reports, through behavior." That distinction mattered deeply. Educational life lesson: behavior observed over time is a more reliable indicator of character than reputation. "You greet guests the same way, regardless of their wealth," Eleanor said. "You maintain composure under pressure. You notice details others ignore." Scarlett remained silent, unsure how to respond to such precise observations. "And most importantly," Eleanor concluded, "you listen." The word lingered in the room like a quiet verdict. Harrison finally spoke. "She's the most emotionally consistent person I've met." Scarlett's eyes flickered toward him in surprise, because he had never said that to her directly. Eleanor noticed the reaction immediately. "You're uncomfortable with praise," she observed. Scarlett gave a small, honest smile. "I'm unfamiliar with it." That answer carried more truth than explanation ever could. Eleanor closed her book and placed it carefully on the side table. "Scarlett," she said, her tone now more intentional, "what do you believe makes a place feel safe?" The question felt deeper than it appeared. Scarlett took a moment. "Predictability," she said. "Consistency and emotional stability in leadership." Eleanor's expression softened. "Interesting." She leaned forward slightly. "And if leadership becomes emotionally unstable?" Scarlett hesitated, but answered honestly, "Then the environment may remain beautiful, but it will no longer feel safe." The room fell silent again, but this silence carried respect. Educational value. Environments are not defined solely by structure or wealth, but by the emotional stability of those who lead them. Eleanor exhaled slowly, as if confirming something internally. "You see beyond appearances," she said. Scarlett lowered her gaze slightly. "I observe patterns." Eleanor nodded approvingly. "Which means you would understand something many people in positions of power fail to grasp." Scarlett looked up. "What is that?" Eleanor's voice became softer, yet more profound. "That legacy is not protected by control." She paused. "It is protected by emotional wisdom." That sentence embedded itself deeply in Scarlett's mind, because it contradicted everything she had subconsciously believed about power and wealth. Harrison remained still, listening carefully. "My family," Eleanor continued, "has spent generations protecting this hotel through strategy, structure, and discipline." Her gaze shifted back to Scarlett. "But strategy without emotional intelligence eventually leads to internal conflict. Educational insight, organizations, and families both suffer when control replaces communication." Scarlett absorbed every word. Not as an employee, not a guest, but as someone being quietly evaluated for something she did not yet understand. "You do not seek attention," Eleanor added. "You do not perform for approval. And you do not mistake silence for weakness." Scarlett's breath caught slightly at that last statement, because that was exactly how she had always navigated life. Quietly, carefully, consistently. Eleanor leaned back once more. "Harrison," she said calmly, "leave us for a moment." He didn't question it, didn't hesitate. He simply nodded and exited the room, closing the doors gently behind him. Now, the atmosphere shifted. More personal, more intentional. Scarlett felt it immediately. Eleanor's gaze remained steady, but not intimidating. Just deeply perceptive. "Tell me something honestly," Eleanor said. Scarlett straightened slightly. "Yes, ma'am. If you were given responsibility over something valuable," Eleanor asked, "would your first instinct be to control it or understand it?" The question felt abstract, yet strangely significant. Scarlett answered, with the same honesty she had shown all afternoon. "I would understand it first." "And why?" Eleanor asked. "Because control without understanding creates fragile stability," Scarlett replied. For the first time, Eleanor smiled fully. Not politely, not socially, genuinely. "That," she said quietly, "is a rare answer." The fountain outside continued its steady rhythm. The sunlight shifted slightly across the floor, and in that quiet, atmospheric room filled with history, Eleanor Ashford reached a decision she would not announce that day, but one that would later change Scarlett's life in a way no one in that family was emotionally prepared for. The room remained quiet long after Eleanor Ashford smiled. Not the kind of quiet that signaled discomfort, but the kind that followed a decision forming beneath the surface, unspoken, deliberate, and emotionally measured. Scarlett sat still, aware that something in the atmosphere had shifted, even though no direct words had confirmed it. Outside, the courtyard fountain continued its steady rhythm, water rising and falling with elegant predictability. It was the same fountain guests admired daily. Yet in that moment, it felt symbolic, consistent, controlled. During, much like the legacy Eleanor had spent decades protecting. "You are not intimidated by silence," Eleanor said, at last. Scarlett met her gaze respectfully. "Silence can be more honest than conversation." Eleanor nodded slowly, as if that response confirmed something she had suspected from the beginning. Educational insight. Emotionally observant individuals often value silence because it allows them to process truth without social pressure. Most people, Eleanor continued, become uncomfortable when a room grows quiet. They rush to fill it with words, opinions, or justifications. She leaned back slightly. "But you don't." Scarlett folded her hands gently in her lap. "I prefer to understand before responding." "And that," Eleanor said softly, "is why Harrison noticed you." Scarlett's expression shifted slightly at the mention of his name, because while their conversations had grown steady over time, she had never fully considered how often he might have spoken about her outside their interactions. "He observes more than he speaks," Scarlett replied. Eleanor gave a faint, knowing smile. "He inherited that from me." The statement carried warmth, but also depth. Generational traits, learned behaviors, inherited emotional patterns, educational value, family dynamics often pass down emotional habits just as strongly as financial legacies. Eleanor turned her attention briefly toward the portraits lining the wall. "Do you know what most people assume about wealthy families?" she asked. Scarlett hesitated. "That they prioritize control." Eleanor's smile deepened slightly. "Correct." She paused. "And in many cases, they are right." That honesty surprised Scarlett more than denial would have. "Control creates the illusion of security," Eleanor continued. "Structure creates predictability, and predictability reduces fear." Scarlett listened carefully. "But," Eleanor added, her voice quieter now, "excessive control also creates emotional distance." The words carried a subtle weight. Not theoretical, personal. Scarlett sensed it immediately. "You're speaking from experience," she said gently. Eleanor did not deny it. "My late husband believed control was the only way to protect legacy," she admitted. And for many years, I agreed. She glanced toward the courtyard again. But legacy, built on fear of loss, becomes fragile. That sentence lingered in the room like a quiet lesson. Educational life lesson. Fear-based leadership may preserve structure, but it often weakens emotional trust. Scarlett absorbed the meaning slowly, because deep down, she understood fear-based protection better than most. It was how she had survived her own childhood. It was how she approached stability. It was how she managed expectations. Eleanor turned back to her. "Tell me, Scarlett," she said calmly. "What do you believe people fear most when they inherit something valuable?" Scarlett did not rush her answer. She thought carefully, then responded, "They might lose it." Eleanor nodded once. And what happens, psychologically, when someone fears losing something they value deeply? Scarlett's voice softened. They become hyper-aware, defensive, cautious, sometimes even suspicious of the people around them. A long silence followed. But this time, it felt intentional. Educational insight. Anticipatory fear can alter perception, making neutral actions appear threatening. "You understand emotional psychology better than most executives I've interviewed," Eleanor said. Scarlett blinked in surprise. "I'm not an executive." "No," Eleanor agreed. "You are something far rarer." She leaned forward slightly. "You are emotionally perceptive without being emotionally reactive." That distinction mattered deeply, because perception without reaction allows for wise decisions. Reaction without perception creates conflict. Scarlett felt an unfamiliar warmth in her chest. Not pride, but recognition. The kind of recognition that acknowledged character, not performance. "And yet," Eleanor continued, "you carry a subtle fear of instability." Scarlett's breath caught slightly. It was not an accusation. It was an observation, and accurate ones were always harder to deny. "My life has been unpredictable," Scarlett admitted carefully. Eleanor's gaze softened, not with pity, but with understanding. "Unpredictable environments teach people to prepare for loss," she said. The sentence landed with quiet precision, because it explained something Scarlett had never fully verbalized before. Why she organized things repeatedly. Why she preferred routines. Why sudden positive changes made her uneasy rather than excited. Educational value. The nervous system often prioritizes safety over happiness when conditioned by past instability. Eleanor stood slowly and walked toward the window, her movements graceful but deliberate. "Look at the hotel," she said. Scarlett joined her near the glass. Guests moved calmly across the courtyard. Staff operated with quiet efficiency. The environment looked flawless, structured, secure. "What do you see?" Eleanor asked. "A well-managed system," Scarlett replied. "And beneath that?" Eleanor pressed gently. Scarlett studied the scene longer. A structure sustained by consistent leadership. Eleanor nodded approvingly. "Exactly." She turned slightly. "This hotel has survived economic crises, leadership transitions, and generational disagreements." Scarlett listened intently. "Not because of its architecture," Eleanor continued. "Not because of its financial value, but because it was led by people who understood both strategy and emotion. Educational insight. Sustainable leadership requires both intellectual and emotional intelligence." Eleanor walked back toward her chair, but did not sit immediately. "Many people in my family understand strategy," she said. "Very few understand emotional stability." The statement carried subtle gravity, and for the first time, Scarlett sensed that this conversation was not casual. It was evaluative. not of her competence as an employee, but of her character as a person. Harrison, Eleanor added, grew up surrounded by legacy expectations. Scarlett nodded slightly. I can imagine that carries pressure. It does, Eleanor confirmed. And pressure often teaches individuals to equate control with security. Scarlett's mind registered that sentence carefully, because it explained something about Harrison she had never fully articulated. His calm nature, his measured speech, his strategic thinking, not dominance, not manipulation, conditioning, educational life lesson. Upbringing shapes emotional responses to power, responsibility, and change. And you, Eleanor said softly, turning back toward Scarlett, were raised in emotional unpredictability. Scarlett stiffened slightly, not offended, just surprised at the accuracy. You prepare for loss, even when stability is present, Eleanor continued. Scarlett exhaled slowly. Yes, the honesty felt heavier now, but also freeing, because being understood reduced the need for emotional defense. Eleanor finally sat down again, folding her hands neatly. I have spent months observing your behavior, she said calmly. Scarlett's heart skipped, not out of fear, but realization. Not just one visit, not just one conversation. Months. You treat every guest with equal respect, Eleanor said. You maintain composure under pressure. You do not seek recognition, and you listen before reacting. Each statement felt precise, tensional, measured. Then Eleanor's voice grew quieter, and, most importantly, you do not mistake power for worth. The weight of that sentence settled deeply into Scarlett's mind, because in environments driven by status, that trait was rare. Outside, the fountain continued flowing. Inside, the atmosphere thickened, not with tension, but with significance. Scarlett, Eleanor said at last, her tone calm but decisive, if a legacy were entrusted to someone, it should not be given to the loudest person in the room. She paused. Nor the most strategic. Another pause. Nor even the most experienced. Scarlett's pulse quickened slightly. Then Eleanor finished the thought. It should be entrusted to the person least likely to be emotionally corrupted by it. Silence followed. Deep, intentional foreshadowing. Scarlett did not yet understand the full implication of those words. She only felt their gravity. And as sunlight shifted across the room, Eleanor Ashford reached for the leather-bound book beside her, not to read, but to close it with quiet finality. A decision had been made, not impulsively, not emotionally, but through months of observation, psychological evaluation, and one defining realization that the woman who feared losing stability the most might also be the one who would protect legacy with the greatest emotional wisdom. And neither Scarlett, Harrison, nor Margaret yet understood how profoundly that silent decision would reshape their relationships, their perceptions, and the fragile balance between love, trust, and control within the Ashford family. The day the will was read did not begin with drama. It began with atmosphere. Soft winter light filtered through the tall windows of the Ashford family conference room, casting long, pale reflections across the polished mahogany table. Outside, the courtyard fountain continued its steady rhythm, unchanged, unaware that within those walls, a decision made months ago was about to alter the emotional structure of an entire family. Scarlett noticed the stillness first. Not the peaceful kind, the anticipatory kind. The kind that settles into a room when everyone present understands that something significant is about to be revealed, yet no one is willing to speak their expectations aloud. She sat beside Harrison, her posture composed, hands folded neatly in her lap. Across from them sat Margaret Ashford, her expression refined, controlled, and emotionally unreadable, the same expression she carried in high-level business meetings and formal family discussions. At the head of the table, the family attorney adjusted a stack of documents with methodical precision. Routine gestures, professional tone, neutral delivery. And yet the emotional weight in the room felt anything but neutral. Educational insight. Atmosphere often communicates emotional tension more honestly than words. Scarlett had attended formal meetings before as an employee, briefings, training sessions, administrative reviews, but this felt different. Heavier, more personal, more final. Harrison's silence beside her was noticeable. Not unusual, but noticeable. He wasn't restless. He wasn't anxious. He wasn't distracted. He was still, and stillness, she had learned over time, could mean deep internal processing rather than emotional indifference. Margaret, on the other hand, sat upright with quiet composure, her fingers lightly resting on the table, her gaze steady but distant, as if she were already analyzing potential outcomes before they were spoken. The attorney cleared his throat. As per the final wishes of Mrs. Eleanor Ashford. The room seemed to tighten slightly, not visibly, but emotionally. Scarlett felt it in her chest before she fully understood why. The attorney continued, his tone steady and professional. Full ownership of the Ashford Grand Hotel and its associated assets, including operational, control, and primary equity holdings, are hereby transferred to Miss Scarlett Hayes. Silence followed. Not confusion, not celebration, silence. The kind of silence that expands slowly, filling every corner of a room until it becomes impossible to ignore. Scarlett did not react immediately. Her mind did not jump to excitement. It did not jump to disbelief. Instead, it paused. Because psychologically, when a person who has lived with emotional unpredictability receives something overwhelmingly significant, the brain does not always process it as gain. It processes it as exposure. $500 million. A generational legacy. A historic institution, all placed into her name, with one formal declaration. Her hotel. The phrase echoed internally, but it did not feel natural. It felt borrowed, temporary, almost fragile. Scarlett's fingers tightened slightly in her lap, not in panic, but in grounding. Across the table, Margaret did not speak. She did not gasp. She did not protest. She smiled, not warmly, not proudly, but with a controlled expression that suggested calculation rather than emotion. That smile would later replay in Scarlett's memory more than the attorney's words. Educational life lesson in high-stakes environments. Reactions are often subtle rather than dramatic. Harrison remained silent. Scarlett glanced at him briefly. His jaw had tightened, almost imperceptibly. His gaze remained fixed on the documents in front of him. Still processing, still controlled, still unreadable. At the time, Scarlett interpreted his silence as shock. Later, her memory would reinterpret it differently. The attorney continued outlining legal clarifications, asset structures, and transition procedures, but the words blurred into a distant hum in Scarlett's mind, because her internal world had shifted, not with joy, but with a quiet question. Why me? Not a question of worth, but of intention. Eleanor Ashford had not been impulsive. She had been observant, strategic, emotionally precise, and that meant this decision had been deliberate. Educational insight. When a thoughtful leader makes an unexpected decision, it is rarely random. It is usually the result of long-term observation. Miss Hayes, the attorney said gently, do you understand the scope of this inheritance? Scarlett inhaled slowly. Yes, she replied, but internally, she understood something deeper. This inheritance was not just financial. It was psychological. It would change how people perceived her, how they interacted with her, how they spoke to her, and, most importantly, how they trusted her. The meeting concluded with professional efficiency. Documents were organized. Formalities were acknowledged. Condolences were exchanged regarding Eleanor's passing. Yet the emotional atmosphere remained restrained. Scarlett stood slowly, her movements controlled, composed, almost mechanical. Not overwhelmed, not celebratory, just aware, extremely aware. As they exited the conference room, the hallway felt unusually quiet. Even the air seemed heavier. Harrison walked beside her, but did not speak immediately. Margaret followed a few steps behind, her heels echoing softly against the marble floor, in steady, measured intervals. Finally, Margaret spoke. "Well," she said calmly, "that was unexpected." Her tone was neutral. "Polished?" "Carefully balanced." Scarlett turned slightly. "Yes?" Margaret folded her hands neatly in front of her. "The Ashford Grand is not merely a business," she continued. "It is a generational institution." Scarlett nodded respectfully. "I understand." Margaret's gaze sharpened slightly. Not hostile, but analytical. "Do you?" she asked. The question was not confrontational. It was evaluative, educational value. Questions framed calmly can carry more psychological pressure than direct criticism. Scarlett chose her response carefully. "I understand its significance," she said, "and the responsibility attached to it." Margaret studied her for a brief moment, then gave a faint nod. "Responsibility," she repeated softly. "Yes, that is the correct word." Harrison finally spoke as they approached the elevator. "My grandmother trusted her," he said simply. Margaret's expression remained composed. "My mother trusted many people," she replied, "but she entrusted very few with legacy-level decisions." That sentence lingered in the air long after it was spoken. Not accusatory, not supportive, ambiguous, and ambiguity, psychologically, often creates more internal tension than direct opposition. The elevator doors opened with a quiet chime. They stepped inside. Silence returned. Scarlett watched the floor numbers descend slowly. Each second felt longer than usual. Not because of discomfort, but because she sensed that this moment marked the beginning of a shift, not just in ownership, but in family dynamics. Educational insight. Major life changes do not only alter circumstances, they alter relationship power balances. When the elevator doors opened into the private lobby, the atmosphere remained elegant, composed, and unchanged on the surface. Guests still checked in. Staff still smiled professionally. The fountain still flowed. But Scarlett felt different. Not superior. Not empowered. Just exposed, as if an invisible spotlight had been placed over her identity overnight. Harrison walked beside her toward the courtyard window. He finally spoke, his voice calm but quieter than usual. "This changes things." Scarlett looked at the fountain. "Yes," she said softly. A pause followed. Then she asked the question forming in her mind since the announcement. "What are you thinking?" Harrison exhaled slowly. "About legacy," he admitted. "Not money, not control. Legacy." That distinction mattered more than he realized. Because while he was thinking about preservation, Scarlett was thinking about perception. And the gap between those two mindsets would soon become the emotional foundation of the misunderstanding that followed. Outside, the fountain continued its steady rhythm. Inside, the emotional structure of trust, power, and interpretation had quietly begun to shift, long before any legal documents, meetings, or strategic discussions would formally enter the picture. The days following the will reading did not erupt into conflict. They settled into formality, and formality, Scarlett would later realize, was far more psychologically complex than open disagreement. The Ashford Grand Hotel continued operating with its usual precision. Guests arriving, staff maintaining standards, the fountain flowing in its steady rhythm as if nothing had changed. But internally, everything had. Not visibly, not dramatically, but structurally. Scarlett noticed it first in conversations. Not was said, but how it was. Transition planning, operational alignment, strategic continuity, polite language, professional language, carefully neutral language, educational insight in high-power environments. Control is rarely introduced through confrontation. It is introduced through formal language and structured discussions. 3 days after the inheritance announcement, the first meeting request arrived. Not from Harrison, not directly from Margaret, but from the family's senior legal advisor. Subject line: Inheritance Transition Consultation. Scarlett stared at the email longer than necessary, not because she didn't understand its purpose, but because she understood its implication. Major inheritances, especially those involving generational businesses, always came with legal structuring. That was rational. That was expected. That was logical. And yet, her chest tightened slightly as she read the attached agenda. Ownership clarification, asset protection strategies, governance recommendations, reasonable topics, neutral topics, but emotionally heavy ones. Educational life lesson. Rational processes can still trigger emotional responses when they affect identity and control. That evening, she sat at the dining table in the penthouse suite, reviewing the documents on her tablet while soft ambient lighting filled the room. Across from her, Harrison worked quietly on his laptop. The atmosphere between them was not tense, just restrained, measured, careful. Scarlett finally spoke. There's a transition meeting scheduled for tomorrow. Harrison looked up briefly. With the legal team? Yes, he nodded once. That's standard. The word standard echoed in her mind, because what felt procedural to him felt personal to her. Educational insight. Two people can experience the same event through entirely different emotional lenses based on upbringing. Do you think it's necessary? She asked calmly. Harrison paused, considering his response, rather than reacting immediately. For an inheritance of this scale, he said, yes. Structuring protects long-term stability. Structuring protects stability. Logical, reasonable, emotionally unsettling. Scarlett lowered her gaze to the screen again. My name is already on the legal ownership, she said softly. It is, he agreed. Then what exactly is being structured? That question lingered longer than expected. Not accusatory, not defensive, just precise. Harrison closed his laptop slowly. Governance roles, he replied. Operational safeguards, advisory oversight. Each phrase sounded professional, responsible, strategic, and yet, internally, Scarlett's mind translated them differently. Overheight, safeguards, governance, control. She did not say that aloud, because emotional maturity had taught her something important. Immediate reactions often escalate misunderstandings before clarity has a chance to form. Educational value. Pausing before reacting is a core skill in emotionally intelligent communication. The next morning, the conference room atmosphere felt colder than it had during the will reading. Not physically, emotionally. The legal advisor greeted her politely, his demeanor respectful but formal. Miss Hayes, he said, congratulations once again on your inheritance. Scarlett nodded. Thank you. Margaret sat at the far end of the table, reviewing printed documents with calm precision. She looked up as Scarlett entered. Good morning, Margaret said smoothly. Good morning, Scarlett replied. Harrison arrived moments later, taking a seat beside Scarlett rather than across from her. A small gesture, but psychologically significant. Alignment without verbal declaration. Educational insight. Physical positioning in meetings often reflects emotional alliances. The advisor began the presentation. As you are aware, the Ashford Grand Hotel represents not only a financial asset, but a legacy institution. In situations of generational transition, it is advisable to establish structured governance to ensure long-term operational continuity. Scarlett listened carefully, not interrupting, not reacting, just observing. A slide appeared on the screen. Proposed governance model. Advisory board inclusion. Strategic oversight committee. Operational decision framework. Her pulse slowed slightly. Not out of fear, out of analysis, because she noticed something subtle. Her name appeared as primary owner, but beneath it, several advisory layers, several structural influences, several decision checkpoints. Educational life lesson. Power structures can be redistributed through governance frameworks without altering legal ownership. Margaret finally spoke. This is not about control, she said calmly. It is about preservation. Scarlett met her gaze. Preservation of what? She asked politely. Margaret's answer came without hesitation. Legacy standards. The room fell quiet again. The advisor continued speaking, but Scarlett's attention had shifted inward because she was beginning to recognize a pattern. Not aggression, not hostility, but strategic caution from people raised to protect institutions, not emotions. Harrison, the advisor said, given your familiarity with the hotel, historical operations, your advisory presence would be beneficial. Scarlett's eyes flickered slightly toward him. Not in suspicion, in awareness. Harrison did not respond immediately. Instead, he asked a question. What level of advisory authority is being proposed? The advisor adjusted his glasses. Non-ownership influence on high-impact operational decisions. That phrasing was careful, extremely careful. Educational insight, language in legal and corporate environments, is often designed to soften the perception of authority shifts. Scarlett leaned back slightly in her chair. Calm, composed, processing, not threatened, but alert. Margaret folded her hands. Scarlett, she said gently, you must understand that assets of this magnitude require experienced oversight. There it was. The same sentence, the same tone, the same polished delivery. And internally, Scarlett felt a quiet emotional echo from her past. You are not capable. You need super. You might lose this. Except this time, she did not react emotionally. She analyzed. Educational value. Emotional growth occurs when a person recognizes internal triggers without immediately acting on them. I appreciate the concern, Scarlett replied calmly, but I would like clarity. Margaret tilted her head slightly. Of course. Scarlett's voice remained steady. Is this structure being proposed because of operational necessity or because of uncertainty in my leadership? The question was respectful, direct, emotionally intelligent. The room went still, not tense, but attentive, because calm clarity often carries more authority than emotional defensiveness. Margaret studied her carefully, then answered with composed honesty. It is being proposed, she said, because legacy institutions are rarely entrusted to individuals without historical governance experience. That answer was neither insulting nor comforting. It was factual, strategic, and psychologically revealing. Scarlett nodded slowly. I see. Harrison remained silent beside her. But this time, his silence felt different. Distant. not detached, conflicted. Educational insight. Silence during complex discussions can indicate internal processing rather than agreement. The advisor resumed the presentation, but Scarlett's internal awareness had already shifted, not toward resistance, not toward submission, but toward understanding. Because for the first time, she realized something deeply important. No one in the room was trying to take the hotel from her directly. They were trying to structure influence around her. Subtly, professionally, strategically. And the difference between control and structured influence would soon become the defining psychological tension of her new life as the unexpected owner of a $500 million legacy. The documents arrived on a quiet Thursday afternoon. Not dramatically, not urgently, not with confrontation, but through a neatly organized digital folder labeled Proposed Governance and Protection Framework. Scarlett noticed the title before she even opened the files. Protection, another carefully chosen word, another emotionally neutral term, carrying structural weight beneath its surface. The penthouse office overlooking the courtyard was filled with soft afternoon light, the same golden glow that once felt calming now carrying a different emotional undertone. Awareness. Not fear, not resistance. Awareness. Educational insight. When individuals enter high-stakes environments, their emotional sensitivity to language and structure increases significantly. Scarlett sat at the desk Eleanor once used during her private visits to the hotel, her fingers resting lightly on the tablet screen as she reviewed the documents one by one. Governance Advisory Charter. Strategic Oversight Clause. Operational Safeguard Measures. Executive Decision Review Protocol. Each title sounded reasonable, responsible, professional, and yet, collectively, they formed something more complex. A system, not removing her ownership, but surrounding it, layering it, guiding it, influencing it. Educational life lesson. Control in modern institutions is rarely taken directly. It is often distributed through advisory structures and procedural layers. She scrolled slowly. Primary legal owner, Scarlett Hayes. Below it, in smaller text, recommended advisory board composition, Margaret Ashford. Legacy oversight, Harrison Ashford. Strategic continuity, external legal consultant, risk management. Scarlett's breathing remained steady, but her mind became sharper, not reactive, analytical, because emotionally intelligent individuals do not only ask, what is being proposed? They ask, what will this look like in practice? And in practice, this structure meant something subtle but powerful. She would legally own the hotel, but key decisions would pass through advisory influence, not forced, not imposed, recommended, strategic, professional. The door behind her opened softly. Harrison stepped inside, his expression calm but observant. You received the documents, he said. Scarlett didn't look up immediately. Yes, he walked closer, but did not sit. Another habit of his, he never positioned himself in a way that felt dominating during serious conversations. Educational insight, body language during discussions about power, reveals underlying emotional intent. What do you think? He asked. Scarlett finally lifted her gaze. I think they are carefully written. That answer was precise. Measure. Neutral. Harrison nodded slightly. They're meant to protect the hotel's long-term stability. There was that word again. Protect. Scarlett turned the tablet toward him. Do you believe protection and influence are always separate concepts? She asked calmly. The question lingered. Not confrontational. Intellectually probing. Harrison studied the screen for a moment before responding. Not always, he admitted. That honesty mattered more than reassurance would have. Educational value. Honest ambiguity often builds more trust than forced certainty. Scarlett leaned back slightly in her chair. When your grandmother observed me, she said quietly. She spoke about emotional wisdom in leadership. Harrison's gaze softened at the mention of Eleanor. She trusted emotional stability, he replied. Yes, Scarlett agreed, not structural control. Silence settled between them. But this silence felt heavier than previous ones, because now the topic was no longer abstract. It was documented, formalized, proposed. Harrison exhaled slowly. You think this is about control? Scarlett shook her head gently. I think this is about fear. That answer shifted the emotional tone of the room. Not defensive, not accusatory. Insightful? Fear of what? He asked. Fear of sudden change, she replied. Fear of legacy disruption. Fear of inexperience. She paused. And possibly fear of emotional unpredictability in leadership. Harrison absorbed that quietly, because deep down, he knew his family's history aligned with that pattern. Educational insight. Generational institutions often prioritize predictability over adaptability, especially after leadership transitions. He moved closer to the desk, finally sitting across from her. My mother believes structure prevents collapse, he said. Scarlett nodded, slowly. That belief is logical. But, he prompted, but logic and emotional perception do not always align, she replied. She tapped lightly on the document. If I sign this as it is, I remain the legal owner. But operationally, influence becomes shared through advisory checkpoints. Harrison did not deny it, because he couldn't. The structure was professional, strategic, subtle, educational life lesson. Legal ownership and practical control are not always the same in complex governance systems. Outside, the fountain continued its steady rhythm, unchanged by the quiet power negotiations unfolding above it. Scarlett stood and walked toward the window, her reflection faintly visible against the glass. When I was younger, she said softly, unexpected positive changes always came with hidden conditions. Harrison remained silent, allowing her to continue. A gift meant future expectations. A promotion meant increased scrutiny. Praise meant pressure. She folded her arms lightly, not defensively, but thoughtfully. So when I suddenly inherited something of this magnitude, she continued, my mind did not interpret it as security. He spoke gently. It interpreted it as exposure. Scarlett nodded once. Yes, that single word carried years of psychological conditioning. Educational value. Past emotional environments shape how individuals interpret success, authority, and responsibility. Harrison leaned forward slightly. My intention, he said carefully, was never to override your authority. Scarlett turned to face him. I know. He blinked slightly, surprised. You do? Yes, she replied, because override requires confrontation. This is structuring. The distinction was sharp, accurate, emotionally intelligent. And structuring, she added quietly, is more psychologically complex than confrontation. The room grew still again. Now tense, not hostile, just deeply aware. Scarlett walked back to the desk and looked at the signature line at the bottom of the primary governance document. Primary owner authorization. Her name typed neatly beneath it. A simple line, a simple signature space. And yet, the implications behind it were anything but simple. Educational insight. Major decisions are often presented through simple actions that carry long-term structural consequences. Harrison followed her gaze. You don't have to sign immediately, he said. Scarlett appreciated that he didn't pressure her, didn't persuade, didn't strategize verbally. Another subtle indicator of his internal conflict. What would happen, she asked calmly, if I declined this structure entirely? Harrison considered carefully before answering. My mother would see it as risk exposure, he said honestly. And you? She asked. He hesitated, then answered truthfully. I would see it as a decision made from emotional conviction rather than fear. That answer lingered longer than reassurance would have, because it acknowledged her agency. Educational life lesson. Support in leadership transitions is not shown by taking control, but by respecting independent decision-making. Scarlett looked down at the documents again, not overwhelmed, not pressured, just aware of the psychological weight behind a single signature. Because she understood something deeply now, no one was forcing her to give up ownership. No one was openly trying to take the hotel. But the structure being proposed would gradually shape how her authority functioned in practice. And the most dangerous shifts in power rarely happen through loud confrontations. They happen through calm documents, strategic language, and decisions that feel reasonable in the moment, but transformative over time. That night, the hotel felt quieter than usual. Not externally. Guests still checked in. Staff still moved with polished efficiency. The fountain still flowed in its steady, elegant rhythm. But from the penthouse, the silence carried a different emotional weight. Scarlett sat alone at the dining table, the documents still open in front of her, their clean formatting and professional language standing in stark contrast to the internal complexity they represented. Governance, framework, advisory oversight, strategic protection measures. Each phrase sounded responsible, reasonable, even supportive. And that was precisely what made the decision so psychologically difficult. Educational insight. The hardest decisions are rarely between right and wrong. They are often between reasonable and personally aligned. She scrolled slowly through the clauses again, her eyes pausing at sections she had already read 3 times, not because she didn't understand them, but because repetition gave her mind time to process emotional implications, rather than just legal definitions. Clause 4.2, Advisory Review, recommended for high-impact operational decisions. Clause 501, Legacy Preservation Consultation Protocol. Clause 6.3, Strategic Continuity Alignment with Historical Governance Practices. The language was elegant, neutral, carefully non-threatening, and yet, collectively, it formed a quiet system of influence. Not ownership removal, not authority elimination, but decision shaping. Educational life lesson. Influence does not always appear as restriction. Sometimes it appears as guidance that gradually redirects authority. Scarlett leaned back slightly, exhaling slowly. Her childhood memories surfaced without invitation, not vividly, but emotionally. Moments when support came with expectations. Moments when gifts came with conditions. Moments when stability felt temporary. And her mind, conditioned by those experiences, was now asking a silent question. If I accept structured oversight, will my independence slowly become symbolic instead of real? The door opened softly. Margaret stepped inside, not abruptly, not intrusively, but with her usual composed presence that carried quiet authority rather than overt dominance. I hope I'm not interrupting, Margaret said smoothly. Scarlett closed the tablet gently. No, I was reviewing the documents. Margaret nodded once and approached the table, her posture elegant and controlled, her expression neutral but observant. She glanced briefly at the screen. They are thorough, she said. Yes, Scarlett replied calmly. They are. Margaret took a seat across from her, folding her hands neatly. The atmosphere between them was not hostile, but it was analytical, measured, strategic. Educational insight. High-control personalities rarely escalate emotionally. They maintain composure to preserve influence. You must understand, Margaret began gently, that inheriting an institution of this magnitude is not merely a financial transition. It is a psychological one. Scarlett studied her carefully. That is true, she agreed. Margaret's gaze sharpened slightly. Not aggressively, but perceptively. My late mother-in-law made an emotionally driven decision, she continued. A decision based on character observation rather than institutional experience. Scarlett did not react defensively, because emotionally intelligent listening often reveals more than reactive disagreement. She believed emotional wisdom was essential in leadership, Scarlett replied. Margaret paused, then nodded slowly. She did. Silence followed. Not uncomfortable, but intentional. Margaret leaned forward slightly. However, she added, emotional wisdom alone does not protect legacy institutions from structural risk. There it was again. Risk, structure, protection, words rooted in logic, but emotionally loaded in implication. Educational value. Logical arguments can still create emotional pressure when tied to identity and responsibility. Scarlett folded her hands gently on the table. Do you believe I am a structural risk? She asked calmly. The question was direct, respectful, clear. Margaret did not flinch. I believe you are untested in institutional governance, she replied. Not insulting, not dismissive, factual, strategic, and psychologically impactful. Scarlett nodded slowly. That is fair. Margaret's eyes flickered with brief surprise. Most people would have reacted defensively. Scarlett responded with acknowledgement. Educational insight. Acknowledging a valid concern does not weaken authority. It strengthens credibility. My concern, Margaret continued, is not ownership. That is legally established. She gestured lightly toward the tablet. My concern is continuity. Scarlett tilted her head slightly. And continuity requires advisory influence? Margaret answered without hesitation. Yes. The clarity of that response removed ambiguity. This was not hidden control. This was openly structured influence, framed as preservation. My family, Margaret added softly, has spent generations ensuring this hotel remains stable, reputable, and emotionally consistent in its leadership. Scarlett's mind registered that phrase carefully. Emotionally consistent leadership. It echoed something Eleanor had said months ago. And suddenly, a deeper realization surfaced. Margaret was not opposing her emotionally. She was protecting the institution psychologically. Educational life lesson. Perceived opposition is sometimes rooted in protective instincts rather than personal distrust. Scarlett leaned back slightly. When the documents were presented, she said calmly, I did not feel threatened. Margaret's expression shifted subtly. You didn't? No, Scarlett replied. I felt evaluated. That distinction changed the tone of the conversation entirely. Margaret remained silent for a moment, then spoke more softly than before. That because you being evaluated. Honesty, direct, unpolished, rare educational insight, transparent communication, even when difficult, builds more long-term trust than polite ambiguity. Scarlett absorbed the statement without visible discomfort. For how long? She asked. Margaret's answer was immediate. Since my mother-in-law began observing you. Months ago. The room fell still, because that confirmation aligned perfectly with Eleanor's earlier behavior. This inheritance had not been sudden. It had been studied, intentional, deliberate. Scarlett's voice softened. She trusted emotional stability over institutional experience. Margaret nodded slowly. She did. And that is precisely why I am cautious. Not resistant. Not hostile. Cautious. Educational value. Caution in leadership transitions often stems from responsibility, not rejection. Scarlett glanced at the signature line again. I nearly signed this earlier, she admitted quietly. Margaret's eyes sharpened. And why didn't you? Scarlett exhaled slowly. Because I realized something important. Silence. Then she continued. If I sign from fear of appearing inexperienced, I reinforce the belief that I cannot lead independently. Margaret did not interrupt. And if I refuse from emotional defensiveness, Scarlett added, I risk proving the very instability the structure is meant to prevent. That level of self-awareness was rare, even in executive environments. Margaret leaned back slowly. You are thinking like a leader, she said. Scarlett met her gaze calmly. I am thinking like someone who understands that fear-based decisions rarely lead to stable outcomes. The fountain outside continued its steady rhythm. The city lights shimmered softly beyond the glass. And in that quiet moment, Scarlett realized something profound. This decision was not about documents, not about legal frameworks, not even about the hotel. It about identity, about whether she would lead from fear of losing control or from clarity about her own emotional capability. She closed the tablet gently. I will not sign tonight, she said calmly. Margaret did not react with disapproval. She simply nodded once. A delayed decision is often wiser than a pressured one. Scarlett stood and walked toward the window, her reflection faintly visible against the night skyline. For the first time, she said softly, I understand why your mother-in-law chose observation over instruction. Margaret's voice came quietly behind her. She believed time reveals emotional consistency better than performance ever could. Scarlett watched the fountain below, steady, predictable, enduring. And as she stood there in the quiet penthouse, she realized that the true test was not whether others were trying to shape her authority, but whether she would allow fear, memory, or pressure to shape the way she exercised it. Pause for a moment and think about this. If you were in Scarlett's position, would you sign the documents for the sake of stability, or refuse them to protect your independence? Comment below, sign or don't sign, and tell me why. Because sometimes in life, the biggest decisions are not about money. They're about identity, self-worth, and emotional clarity. And if you believe stories should teach real-life lessons about relationships, power, and personal growth, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Love Stories by Mr. Johnson for more meaningful and inspiring love stories. The emotional distance did not begin with an argument. It began with silence that lasted slightly longer than usual. The penthouse dining area remained as elegant as ever. Soft ambient lighting, polished surfaces, and a view of the courtyard fountain that had become a quiet symbol of consistency in Scarlett's increasingly complex life. Yet the atmosphere between her and Harrison had shifted in a way that was difficult to define, but impossible to ignore. Not cold, not hostile, not broken, just restrained. Educational insight. Emotional distance in relationships rarely appears suddenly. It develops gradually through unspoken assumptions and delayed conversations. Harrison sat across from her, reviewing financial reports on his tablet, his posture composed and his expression calm in the way it had always been. To an outside observer, nothing seemed wrong. But Scarlett noticed the difference. He spoke less during meals now, paused longer before answering, observed more than he expressed. And observation, when paired with silence, can be misinterpreted in emotionally sensitive environments. Scarlett folded her napkin carefully beside her plate, a small habit she maintained whenever her mind felt unsettled. The movement was controlled, precise, almost ritualistic. I met with your mother today, she said gently. Harrison looked up immediately. Not defensive, not alarmed, just attentive. How did it go? He asked. Scarlett considered the most accurate answer. Calm, she replied. A pause followed. Then she added, strategic. That single word carried more meaning than a detailed explanation would have. Harrison leaned back slightly in his chair, exhaling slowly. She believes structure prevents instability, he said. I know, Scarlett replied. Silence returned, but this silence felt heavier than the quiet they once shared comfortably during her early days at the hotel. Educational life lesson. Silence that once felt safe can begin to feel uncertain when circumstances introduce power shifts or unspoken tension. Scarlett glanced toward the window. The fountain below continued its steady rhythm, unchanged by human complexity. I didn't sign the documents, she said softly. Harrison's reaction was subtle, but noticeable. His fingers paused mid-scroll on the tablet. All right, he said calmly, not relieved, not concerned, just composed. Scarlett watched him carefully. You're not surprised? She asked. He shook his head slightly. No, why? She pressed gently. Harrison rested the tablet on the table. Because you don't make decisions under emotional pressure, he replied. The accuracy of that statement surprised her more than any strong reaction would have. Educational insight. Being emotionally understood can feel both comforting and unsettling when internal doubts are present. She leaned back slightly in her chair. I almost signed, she admitted. That time, Harrison's expression changed. Not dramatically, but enough. What stopped you? He asked. Scarlett's gaze lowered briefly. Clarity, she said. He nodded slowly. That makes sense. Another pause, another quiet stretch of air filled with thoughts, neither of them immediately voiced. Educational value. Healthy communication requires emotional transparency, but transparency often feels risky when power dynamics are involved. Scarlett noticed something else now. Harrison was choosing his words more carefully than before, measuring responses, analyzing tone, almost as if he feared saying the wrong thing. And that realization triggered a subtle emotional shift within her. Not resentment, not anger, but concern. Because cautious communication in marriage can sometimes signal internal conflict rather than emotional withdrawal. You've been quiet lately, she said. Harrison did not deny it. I've been thinking, he replied. About the hotel? She asked. About everything, he said. The answer was honest, broad, and emotionally revealing. Scarlett studied his expression carefully. Years ago, when they first met, his silence felt observant and grounding. Now, under the weight of inheritance and family expectations, the same silence felt layered. Educational insight. Context changes how behaviors are interpreted. The same action can feel safe in one phase of life and uncertain in another. Are you conflicted? She asked gently. Harrison did not respond immediately. Instead, he stood and walked toward the window, mirroring a habit Scarlett herself had developed over recent weeks. Finally, he spoke. Yes, the honesty was quiet, but powerful. Scarlett remained seated, allowing him the space to continue. My grandmother trusted you, he said. My mother is cautious about the transition, and I am positioned between legacy and marriage. That sentence carried emotional complexity, far beyond its calm delivery. Educational life lesson. Being emotionally in the middle of family and spouse is one of the most psychologically challenging positions in relationships. Scarlett's chest tightened slightly, not from hurt, but from understanding. You feel responsible for both, she said. Yes, he replied simply. Silence followed, again, but this time It felt more transparent, less mysterious, more human. Scarlett stood and joined him near the window. "For weeks," she said softly, "I thought your silence meant agreement with the governance structure." Harrison turned toward her. "It didn't," he said. That answer came faster than expected. "What did it mean?" she asked. He exhaled slowly. "It meant I was trying to understand how to support you, without appearing to influence your authority." The statement landed deeply, because it revealed a perspective she had not fully considered. Educational insight. Support can sometimes appear as distance when a person fears overstepping boundaries. Scarlett's eyes softened slightly. "You didn't want to pressure me?" "No," he replied, "because the decision had to be yours." That clarity shifted something internally, not dramatically, but meaningfully. Scarlett leaned lightly against the glass, watching the fountain below. "I interpreted your silence as emotional withdrawal," she admitted. Harrison's expression tightened slightly. "And I interpreted your independence as a need for space," he said. They both paused, because in that moment, a shared realization emerged. They had not been emotionally distancing themselves intentionally. They had been protecting each other in opposite ways. Educational value. Misinterpretation in relationships often occurs when both partners act from care, but communicate through assumption instead of dialogue. "I didn't want to burden you," Scarlett continued quietly. "You inherited something enormous. I thought giving you autonomy was the most respectful form of support." She turned toward him fully. But autonomy without emotional reassurance can feel like isolation. The truth in that sentence settled between them. Deep, unavoidable. Harrison looked down, briefly, processing. "I should have asked more," he admitted. "I should have spoken sooner," she replied. No accusations, no raised voices, just calm accountability. Educational life lesson. Healthy relationships are strengthened when both partners acknowledge miscommunication without assigning blame. The evening light dimmed slightly as the sun lowered behind the skyline, casting softer shadows across the penthouse. For the first time in weeks, the silence between them felt different. Not heavy, not distant, but reflective. Yet beneath that growing clarity, a deeper tension still remained, unspoken but present. Because, while they were beginning to understand each other emotionally, the external pressures of legacy, governance, and family influence had not disappeared. And emotional understanding, while powerful, would soon be tested by a revelation neither of them was fully prepared to confront. The following days unfolded with a quiet normalcy that felt almost deceptive. Meetings continued. Reports were reviewed. Guests arrived and departed with the same polished rhythm that had defined the Ashford Grand Hotel for decades. On the surface, nothing appeared fractured. Yet beneath that composure, Scarlett felt something subtle shifting inside her marriage. Not dramatically, not visibly, but emotionally. It was not the absence of love. It was the presence of careful restraint. Educational insight. Emotional restraint in relationships often emerges when both partners fear causing additional pressure during stressful life transitions. One evening, as soft instrumental music played faintly through the penthouse speakers, Scarlett sat on the sofa reviewing operational summaries Eleanor had once personally overseen. The documents were filled with annotations, notes about guest experience, staff morale, and emotional consistency in leadership. Not profit margins first, not expansion strategies first, but emotional environment first. That realization grounded her, because it reminded her that the inheritance had not been purely financial. It had been philosophical. "You're studying her notes again," Harrison said gently from across the room. Scarlett looked up. "Yes," he approached slowly, not intruding, just joining her space with quiet intention. "What do you find in them?" he asked. She handed him one of the pages. She prioritized emotional stability over operational dominance, Scarlett said. Harrison skimmed the note, then gave a faint nod. That sounds like her. Scarlett folded her hands thoughtfully. It also explains why she chose observation over instruction. A silence followed. Not uncomfortable, but contemplative. Educational life lesson. Leaders who observe before acting often make more emotionally sustainable decisions. Harrison sat beside her, maintaining a respectful distance rather than closing the physical space abruptly. It was a habit she had come to recognize, his way of offering presence without imposing emotional intensity. I spoke with my mother today, he said. Scarlett's posture stiffened, almost imperceptibly. Not defensively, but cautiously. And, she asked, she believes delaying the governance structure increases long-term institutional risk, he replied calmly. There it was again. Risk, structure, continuity. Words that sounded rational, yet carried emotional implications when repeated consistently. Scarlett exhaled slowly. I expected that perspective. Harrison studied her face carefully. You're not upset. She shook her head slightly. No, then she added quietly. But I am aware. That word carried depth, because awareness meant she was no longer reacting instinctively. She was analyzing patterns. Educational insight. Emotional awareness reduces impulsive reactions, but can increase internal processing time. Harrison leaned back slightly. She isn't questioning your ownership, he said. She's questioning my leadership readiness, Scarlett replied. He did not deny it, because denial would have been intellectually dishonest, and Harrison had always valued honesty over emotional convenience. That's not entirely unreasonable, he said carefully. Scarlett turned toward him. The statement did not offend her, but it did invite deeper reflection. Do you believe I'm unprepared? She asked. Harrison paused longer this time, not out of hesitation, but out of respect for the weight of the question. I believe you're emotionally capable, he said. And institutionally? She pressed gently. He exhaled, still adapting. The honesty was calm, measured, and emotionally complex. Educational value, honest feedback in relationships, strengthens trust when delivered with respect rather than judgment. Scarlett nodded slowly. I agree, she said. That response surprised him. You do? He asked. Yes, she replied, because adaptation takes time, not resistance. Silence returned again, but this silence felt less tense and more grounded in mutual understanding. Yet something subtle lingered beneath the surface, a psychological gap neither of them had fully addressed. Harrison spoke again, his voice softer. You've been carrying this alone. Scarlett blinked slightly. What do you mean? The inheritance, he clarified. The meetings, the expectations, the analysis. She looked down at her hands. I didn't want to overwhelm you. The admission was quiet, audible, and revealing. Educational life lesson. Many individuals with high responsibility suppress emotional vulnerability to avoid burdening loved ones. Harrison leaned forward slightly. You weren't burdening me, he said. I thought giving you space was respectful, she replied. And I thought not interfering was supportive, he countered. They both paused, because, once again, the pattern revealed itself clearly. Two people acting from care, two people misinterpreting each other's emotional signals. Educational insight, miscommunication often occurs not from neglect, but from protective assumptions. Scarlett stood and walked toward the window, her reflection faintly visible against the evening skyline. "When I was younger," she said slowly, "major life changes usually came with emotional consequences." Harrison listened without interruption. "So when this inheritance happened," she continued, "my mind prepared for relational shifts." He frowned slightly. "You expected distance." "Yes," she admitted. "And when I became quieter," he said, "it confirmed that expectation." Scarlett turned toward him. Yes, the truth was simple, painfully simple. Educational value, expectation bias can shape how we interpret neutral behaviors, especially during stressful transitions. Harrison ran a hand slowly through his hair, a rare sign of internal tension. "I wasn't distancing myself," he said. "I was recalibrating." The word caught her attention. "Recalibrating," she repeated. "Yes," he replied. "You went from being my partner who worked at the hotel to the legal owner of my family's legacy institution." He paused. That shift required emotional adjustment. Scarlett absorbed the statement deeply. Because she had been so focused on how the inheritance affected her identity, she had not fully considered how it affected his. Educational insight. Major life shifts impact not only the individual directly affected, but also those emotionally connected to them. "I didn't want to influence your decisions," Harrison continued, "and I didn't want my position as your husband to be confused with institutional influence." Her eyes softened slightly. "So you became more reserved." "Yeah." "And I interpreted that as emotional distance." "Yes." Another pause. But this time, it carried clarity instead of confusion. Scarlett leaned lightly against the glass. "For weeks," she said quietly, "I thought I was being evaluated alone." Harrison stood and joined her near the window. "You weren't," he replied. She looked at him. "I was evaluating myself, too." That admission shifted something internally, because self-evaluation often creates more emotional pressure than external judgment. Educational life lesson. Internal pressure can feel heavier than external expectations when individuals hold themselves to high emotional standards. The fountain below continued its steady rhythm, unchanged by the psychological complexity unfolding above it. Harrison spoke softly. "Do you feel isolated?" Scarlett considered the question carefully, then answered honestly, "Not isolated." He waited. "Just hyper-aware," she finished. The distinction mattered. Hyper-awareness meant emotional vigilance, not loneliness. "I don't regret the inheritance," she added, "but I am aware that it altered how every conversation around me is now framed." "Through leadership perception," Harrison said. "Yes, and through legacy expectations," he added. Scarlett nodded. "And through self-doubt," she admitted quietly. The honesty lingered between them. Raw, unfiltered, human. Harrison's voice softened further. "You are not doubting your worth." She looked at him. "You are questioning your readiness." The accuracy of that statement settled deeply within her, because for the first time, she realized something profound. She had never feared losing the hotel itself. She had feared failing the emotional responsibility attached to it. Educational insight. Fear of responsibility often disguises itself as fear of loss. The room grew quieter as night fully settled outside. And in that calm, reflective silence, their emotional distance did not vanish instantly, but it transformed from misunderstanding into mutual awareness. Yet even as clarity grew between them, both understood an unavoidable truth. Their emotional understanding might be improving, but the external pressures of legacy, governance, and institutional expectation were only beginning to intensify. The truth about Harrison's silence did not reveal itself in a dramatic moment. It revealed itself in patterns. Patterns Scarlett had seen before, but only from her own emotional perspective. Now, for the first time since the inheritance, the atmosphere inside the penthouse carried a different kind of stillness. Not tense, not uncertain, but reflective, as if the emotional distance that once felt confusing was slowly being replaced by a deeper layer of understanding. Early morning light spread across the living area, soft and diffused, illuminating documents neatly stacked on the desk, and Eleanor's handwritten notes resting beside them like quiet reminders of the philosophy she had lived by. Observation before reaction. Understanding before control. Emotional stability before authority. Scarlett stood near the window, watching the courtyard fountain below when she noticed Harrison already awake, standing at the far end of the room, reviewing a series of archived reports on the hotel's historical operations. He had been doing that more often lately. Not casually, not habitually, intentionally. Educational insight. When individuals feel a shift in responsibility tied to legacy, they often return to historical data as a psychological grounding mechanism. You've been reading those every morning, Scarlett said, gently. Harrison didn't turn immediately. Yes? She walked closer, noticing the reports were dated decades back, long before her involvement with the hotel. Operational records from your grandmother's early years? She asked. He nodded. She documented everything, he replied. Not just finances, staff behavior patterns, guest satisfaction trends, leadership decisions during crises. Scarlett's eyes softened slightly. She led emotionally, she said. Yes, he agreed, but she also understood structure. He finally turned to face her. And that balance is what my family fears losing. The honesty in his voice felt different today. Less restrained, more transparent. Educational value. Fear in leadership transitions often stems from the perceived loss of institutional balance, not just authority. Scarlett leaned lightly against the desk. You're not afraid of me owning the hotel, she said quietly. It wasn't a question, was an observation. Harrison held her gaze. No, pause. I'm afraid of what sudden structural change can do to a legacy institution. That distinction was critical because it separated personal trust from institutional concern. Educational insight. People can trust an individual emotionally while still fearing systemic change professionally. Scarlett folded her arms thoughtfully. For weeks, she said, I believed your silence meant internal conflict about the inheritance. Harrison exhaled slowly. It did, he admitted. Her chest tightened slightly, but not with hurt. With curiosity. Not about you, he clarified. About my position. That response shifted the emotional landscape instantly. My position as your husband, and as the grandson of the woman who built her life around protecting that hotel. He walked toward the window, mirroring a habit they had both developed during difficult conversations. When the will was read, he continued, I experienced two simultaneous thoughts. Scarlett remained silent, allowing him to articulate fully. First, she chose correctly. Her eyes flickered in surprise. And second, she asked softly that the emotional and structural weight placed on you was far greater than anyone in that room acknowledged. The admission landed deeply. Educational life lesson. Perceptive partners often recognize emotional burdens before they are verbally expressed. Scarlett's voice softened. You never said that. Harrison gave a faint, almost reflective smile. Because I knew anything I said immediately, after the inheritance, could be interpreted as influence. That sentence reframed weeks of silence in an entirely new light. Educational insight. Strategic silence is sometimes used to preserve another person's autonomy, not to withdraw emotionally. I was aware, he continued, that any strong opinion from me could create pressure, whether supportive or critical. Scarlett processed that slowly. So you chose neutrality. I chose restraint, he corrected gently. The distinction mattered. Neutrality could imply indifference. Restraint implied intention. Educational value. Restraint, in emotionally complex situations, often reflects respect rather than detachment. He returned to the desk and rested his hands lightly on the archived reports. My mother views legacy through structural preservation, he said. My grandmother viewed it through emotional consistency. I grew up between those two philosophies. Scarlett listened carefully. Control versus understanding, she said. Yes, the inheritance forced those philosophies into direct alignment, he added. Silence followed. But now it felt clarifying, rather than heavy. For my entire life, Harrison continued, the hotel was never described to me as property. Scarlett tilted her head slightly. How was it described? As responsibility, he replied. He picked up one of Eleanor's old notes and read quietly. Institutions fail when leadership prioritizes authority over emotional stability. He placed the note back down gently. That principle shaped how I was raised. Scarlett absorbed the meaning fully, because suddenly his behavior made deeper psychological sense. His calm nature, his measured speech, his reluctance to impose decisions, not avoidance. Conditioning. Educational insight, upbringing within legacy-focused families often emphasizes emotional control and long-term thinking over immediate expression. When the governance documents were introduced, Harrison said, I wasn't evaluating your capability. Scarlett's voice softened. You were evaluating institutional risk. Yes, and how my sudden leadership role might affect operational continuity. Yes, the clarity between them deepened. But so did the complexity. Scarlett stepped closer. Then, why didn't you say that earlier? Harrison hesitated. Not from uncertainty, from careful honesty. Because explaining institutional risk during your emotional transition could have sounded like doubt in your ability. The truth in that statement settled heavily, but not painfully. Educational life lesson. Timing of communication can determine whether honesty is perceived as support or criticism. Scarlett exhaled slowly, and your silence, unintentionally, created the opposite effect. Yes, he admitted. Another pause. This time, one filled with shared accountability rather than misunderstanding. I thought, Scarlett said quietly, that I was being emotionally evaluated by your family alone. Harrison shook his head gently. You were being evaluated by the institution itself. She blinked slightly. What do you mean? The hotel, he said calmly, is not just a business structure. It is a system shaped by decades of leadership patterns, staff expectations, and operational culture. He gestured toward the courtyard below. You inherited not just ownership, but psychological leadership influence, educational insight. Leadership transitions impact organizational psychology, not just authority structures. Scarlett looked down at the fountain. Steady, predictable, enduring. And you, she said slowly, were recalibrating your role within that new structure. Yes, as a husband. Yes, as a legacy heir. Yes, and as someone who didn't want to unintentionally shape my decisions. Harrison met her gaze. Yes, the simplicity of that admission carried profound emotional clarity. For weeks, she had interpreted his silence as distance, when in reality, it had been restraint, rooted in respect. Educational value. Misinterpretation often occurs when internal motives remain unspoken during high-stress transitions. Harrison's voice grew quieter. There was something else I was concerned about. Scarlett's expression softened. What? That the inheritance would isolate you emotionally. The words struck deeper than any governance document ever could. Why? She asked. Because sudden elevation in responsibility, he said, often creates psychological distance between the individual and their support system. Educational life lesson: major life upgrades can unintentionally create emotional isolation if communication is not actively maintained. Scarlett looked at him steadily. Did it? He did not answer immediately. Instead, he asked a question of his own. For a while, did you feel alone in your decision-making? The silence that followed was quiet, honest, unavoidable, because for the first time since inheriting the Ashford Grand Hotel, Scarlett realized that while she had been analyzing legal structures, governance frameworks, and leadership expectations, Harrison had been quietly analyzing something far more personal. Whether the weight of legacy was slowly pushing her into emotional isolation without either of them fully recognizing it. Scarlett did not answer Harrison's question immediately. For a brief moment, the only sound in the penthouse was the distant rhythm of the courtyard fountain and the faint hum of the city waking beyond the glass walls. The silence felt heavier now, not confusing, not distant, but deeply reflective. For a while, did you feel alone in your decision-making? The question lingered. Not accusatory, not dramatic, but precise. Scarlett lowered her gaze slightly, her fingers resting lightly against the edge of the desk as she considered the most honest response. Yes, she said quietly. The word was soft, but it carried weeks of internal pressure. Not because she had been abandoned, not because she had been unsupported, but because she had been internally processing more than she had been expressing. Educational insight. Emotional isolation does not always come from lack of support. It often comes from self-imposed emotional restraint during high responsibility periods. Harrison did not react defensively. He nodded once, slowly, as if confirming something he had suspected, rather than discovering something new. I was worried about that, he admitted. Scarlett looked up. You knew. I observed it, he replied calmly. He walked toward the window again, his posture composed but thoughtful, his movements deliberate rather than restless. You began reviewing documents alone, he continued. You analyzed governance structures without discussing your internal concerns. You processed pressure intellectually rather than emotionally. Each observation was accurate, painfully accurate. Educational value. Highly responsible individuals often shift into analytical mode to maintain emotional control under pressure. Scarlett exhaled slowly. I thought independence was expected of me, she said. Harrison turned slightly. Independence in leadership, he replied, does not require emotional isolation. That distinction settled deeply within her, because she had unconsciously equated strength with silent endurance. Educational life lesson. True strength in leadership is not silent endurance. It is emotionally balanced decision-making with support. I didn't want to appear overwhelmed, she admitted quietly. To whom? He asked gently. Scarlett paused. Your mother, the advisors, the institution itself. Another silence followed. But this silence was illuminating, rather than heavy. Harrison's expression softened. And about me? He asked. The question was simple, but emotionally significant. Scarlett's eyes flickered slightly. With you, she said slowly. I didn't want my emotional processing to be mistaken for uncertainty. Harrison absorbed that without interruption, because he understood something crucial in that moment. She had not been distancing herself from him. She had been protecting her perceived credibility as a leader. Educational insight. When individuals enter leadership roles suddenly, they often suppress vulnerability to avoid appearing unprepared. He stepped closer, but not abruptly. Measured, respectful, present. You were never required to prove emotional invulnerability to me, he said quietly. Scarlett's chest tightened slightly. Not from pressure, but from realization. I know that now, she replied. The honesty felt grounding, not heavy, not defensive, just real. She walked toward the sofa and sat down slowly, her posture more relaxed than it had been in days. When the governance documents arrived, she continued, I interpreted them as a subtle redistribution of influence. Harrison nodded. That interpretation was reasonable. She looked at him, slightly surprised. You don't disagree? No, he said calmly. The structure was designed to introduce institutional influence without altering legal ownership. The clarity of his statement removed any lingering ambiguity. Educational value, clear acknowledgement of structural realities prevents emotional misinterpretation and builds trust. Scarlett leaned back slightly. And your silence during that period? He was not agreement, he finished gently. She nodded. I thought it was. Harrison exhaled slowly. It was evaluation. Of me? She asked. Oh, the situation? He corrected. He sat across from her, maintaining the same respectful distance he always did during serious discussions. I was evaluating 3 factors simultaneously, he continued. Scarlett listened intently. Your emotional adaptation, my family's institutional response, and the long-term psychological impact of sudden leadership transition. The structured clarity of his thought process surprised her, but it also explained his behavior. Educational insight. Individuals raised in legacy-focused environments often process emotional situations through structured evaluation rather than immediate expression. You were thinking long-term, she said. Yes, and I was thinking internally, she added. Another pause. Then Harrison spoke more softly than before. There is something you misunderstood about my silence. Scarlett's attention sharpened. What? I was not distancing myself from you, he said. I was deliberately avoiding influencing your leadership identity. The words landed with profound clarity, because suddenly, weeks of emotional ambiguity rearranged themselves into a new perspective. Educational life lesson. Respect-driven restraint can sometimes be misinterpreted as emotional withdrawal. If I had strongly supported or opposed the governance structure, he continued, it would have introduced external pressure into what needed to be your independent decision. Scarlett processed that slowly. You wanted the choice to be authentically mine. Yes, even if that meant appearing emotionally distant. Yes, silence followed again. But now it felt lighter, more grounded, more understanding. Scarlett's voice softened. That must have been difficult. Harrison gave a faint, thoughtful smile. It was unfamiliar. In what way? She asked. For most of my life, he replied, I was trained to intervene strategically in institutional matters. He glanced briefly at the archived reports on the desk. To step back intentionally, he added, required conscious restraint. Educational insight. Behavioral restraint is often more psychologically demanding than active intervention for individuals trained in leadership environments. Scarlett's eyes softened. So while I thought you were disengaging, I was actively recalibrating, he finished. She let out a quiet breath. That word again, he nodded, because everything changed overnight. He gestured subtly toward the hotel below. The institutional hierarchy shifted. The ownership structure shifted. And our relational dynamic was placed under external observation. That last statement caught her attention. External observation, she repeated. Yes, he said calmly. Advisors, board members, senior staff. They are all psychologically assessing how leadership stability presents itself during transition. Scarlett's mind registered the implication immediately. Her behavior was not only personal, it was being professionally interpreted. Educational value. Leadership roles involve continuous psychological observation, even in private behavioral patterns. For weeks, Harrison continued, you maintained composure under pressure, avoided reactive decisions, and delayed signing structural documents until clarity emerged. Scarlett blinked slightly. You noticed all of that. I notice patterns, he replied simply. The irony of that statement was not lost on her, because that was exactly how she had always navigated life. Through observation, through pattern recognition, through emotional analysis. Another quiet moment passed before Scarlett spoke again. There is something I need to ask you, honestly. Harrison met her gaze. Of course. When the inheritance was announced, she said slowly, did any part of you feel that it should have remained within your direct family line? The question was calm, respectful, but deeply important. Harrison did not hesitate. No. The certainty in his voice was immediate. Scarlett searched his expression carefully. You're sure? Yes, he replied. My grandmother did not make impulsive decisions. She made observed decisions. He paused, and she observed you for months before changing the will. The weight of that truth settled deeply within the room, not as pressure, but as validation. Educational life lesson. Decisions based on long-term observation often carry deeper intentionality than those based on tradition or expectation. Scarlett leaned back slowly, her shoulders relaxing in a way they hadn't in weeks. For the first time, she said quietly, I feel like I'm not navigating this transition alone. Harrison's voice softened. You never were. The fountain outside continued its steady rhythm. Consistent, grounded, unchanging. And as the morning light filled the penthouse, Scarlett realized something profoundly educational about her own emotional journey. She had spent weeks preparing to defend her authority from external influence, when the person closest to her had actually been protecting her independence through deliberate emotional restraint. And that realization did not erase the external pressures of legacy, governance, and institutional expectation, but it transformed the emotional foundation upon which she would now face them. The conversation that changed everything did not begin with anger. It began with timing. Late afternoon sunlight filtered through the tall glass windows of the Ashford Grand penthouse, casting long golden reflections across the marble floor. The atmosphere was calm, elegant, and outwardly composed. Yet emotionally, Scarlett could sense a quiet turning point approaching. Not because of conflict, but because clarity, once reached internally, eventually demands external expression. Educational insight, emotional clarity naturally leads to necessary conversations, especially in high-stakes relationships and leadership transitions. Scarlett stood in the kitchen, absent-mindedly wiping the same corner of the counter once again. Not twice this time. Just once. A small shift, a subtle one, but psychologically significant. Because habits rooted in anxiety often begin to soften when internal understanding increases. Behind her, the soft sound of footsteps approached. Harrison paused near the doorway, observing silently for a moment before speaking. You wiped it once? He said, gently. Scarlett didn't turn immediately. I noticed that too, she replied. Her tone was calm, not tense, not guarded, just reflective. Educational value. Small behavioral changes often signal deeper emotional processing, long before major decisions are voiced. The room remained quiet for few seconds. Then Scarlett spoke again. I've been thinking about something your grandmother asked me months ago. Harrison leaned lightly against the doorway. What did she ask if I were given responsibility over something valuable? Scarlett said, slowly, would my instinct be to control it or understand it? Harrison's expression softened slightly. That sounds like her. Scarlett finally turned to face him. I answered that I would understand it first. And you still believe that? He asked. Yes, she said, then added quietly. But understanding requires confronting uncomfortable truths. That sentence shifted the emotional tone immediately. Not dramatically, but undeniably. Educational insight. True emotional growth involves confronting truths that were previously avoided for the sake of stability. Harrison stepped further into the kitchen. What truth are you confronting? He asked calmly. Scarlett rested her hand lightly on the counter, grounding herself in the present moment. For weeks, she said, I believed your silence meant uncertainty about me. Harrison did not interrupt. And I believed your mother's structured proposals meant a gradual attempt to reshape my authority. Still, he remained silent. Not defensive, not dismissive. Listening. Carefully. Educational life lesson. Active listening during emotionally important conversations prevents escalation and promotes clarity. Scarlett exhaled slowly. But now, she continued, I see something more complex. What? He asked softly. That no one openly challenged my ownership, she said. No attempted to revoke authority. No one forced structural compliance. She paused. Instead, influence was introduced through language, caution, and institutional concern. Harrison nodded slightly. That accurate. The honesty in his response strengthened the emotional safety of the conversation. Scarlett walked toward the window, watching the fountain below as she gathered her thoughts. When sudden responsibility is placed on someone, she said, the environment around them often shifts before they fully understand why. Educational insight. Leadership transitions alter relational dynamics, even when personal relationships remain intact. Harrison joined her near the window, maintaining the same respectful distance he always had during serious discussions. You felt the shift, he said. Yes, and interpreted it as potential loss of autonomy. Yes? Silence followed. But it felt constructive, not heavy, not uncertain. Scarlett turned slightly toward him. There is something I need to ask you directly, she said. Harrison's posture straightened subtly. Ask. She hesitated for only a moment. Did any part of you ever believe the hotel should be managed primarily through your family's traditional structure rather than my independent leadership? The question was calm, respectful, but deeply important. Harrison answered without hesitation. No. The certainty in his voice was immediate and grounded. Scarlett studied his expression carefully, not even strategically. She pressed gently. He shook his head. My concern was never about reclaiming structural influence, he said. It was about ensuring institutional stability during a sudden leadership transition. The distinction mattered deeply. Educational value. Concern for stability is not inherently opposition to new leadership. It is often a protective reflex. Scarlett nodded slowly. That aligns with your behavior. Harrison gave a faint, thoughtful smile. I was hoping it would. She leaned lightly against the glass, her reflection faintly visible against the skyline. But there is another truth, she continued quietly. Harrison waited. I almost signed the governance documents. That statement shifted the air between them. Not explosively, but significantly. He did not react with alarm. Instead, he asked calmly, what stopped you? Scarlett's voice softened. Realization. He remained silent, encouraging her to elaborate. I realized that signing from fear of appearing inexperienced would undermine the very emotional stability your grandmother valued in leadership. Harrison's eyes reflected something new now. Not concern, not surprise, respect, educational insight. Decisions rooted in emotional clarity, rather than fear, lead to more sustainable leadership outcomes. Scarlett turned fully toward him now. For the first time, she said, I understood that the real pressure was not about ownership. He tilted his head slightly. Then, was it about perception? She replied. How I would be perceived as a leader. How my decisions would be interpreted institutionally. And whether emotional composure would be mistaken for uncertainty. Harrison absorbed that carefully. That is a highly accurate institutional dynamic, he said. She gave a faint, almost tired smile. I learned it faster than I expected. Another quiet pause settled in the room. But this one felt different, lighter, more honest. Scarlett's voice grew softer. There is one more thing I need to confront. Harrison's gaze remained steady. What is it? She hesitated briefly, then spoke with calm honesty. I confused protection with control. The admission landed deeply, not as self-criticism, but as self-awareness. Educational life lesson. Misinterpreting protective behavior as control is common during periods of sudden responsibility and stress. Harrison exhaled slowly. And I, he replied quietly, confused restraint with support. Their eyes met. And in that moment, a shared realization formed, not dramatic, not emotional in an overwhelming way, but profoundly grounding. They had not been opposing each other. They had been navigating the same pressure from different psychological positions. Scarlett looked back at the counter briefly. I was preparing to defend my authority, she said. And I was preparing to avoid influencing it, Harrison replied. Another silence followed, but this silence felt transformative. Educational insight. Many relational conflicts arise not from opposing intentions, but from unspoken protective behaviors. Scarlett inhaled slowly. I think it's time, she said, softly. For what? Harrison asked. To have the conversation we've both been approaching indirectly for weeks. He nodded once. With my mother. The weight of that statement settled immediately. Not as fear, not a dread, but as inevitability, because emotional clarity between them was only the first step. The true turning point would come when that clarity extended beyond private understanding into a direct, calm confrontation with the institutional caution and legacy-driven mindset that had quietly shaped every structured proposal since the inheritance. The meeting with Margaret was scheduled for the following morning. Not urgently, not dramatically, but deliberately, and that distinction mattered, because Scarlett no longer approached the conversation from emotional defensiveness, but from clarity, something far more stable than reaction. The private conference room overlooked the courtyard fountain, just as it had on the day the will was read. Sunlight filtered softly through the tall windows, illuminating the polished table where so many strategic discussions had taken place over the years. Only this time, the atmosphere felt different, less anticipatory, more intentional. Educational insight. When difficult conversations are approached with emotional clarity rather than fear, the atmosphere naturally becomes more constructive than confrontational. Margaret was already seated when Scarlett and Harrison entered. Her posture was composed, her expression calm, and her hands rested neatly on a folder placed directly in front of her, a familiar visual symbol of preparation and structure. Good morning, Margaret said smoothly. Good morning, Scarlett replied. Harrison nodded respectfully, but remained silent, taking a seat slightly beside Scarlett, rather than between them. The positioning. was subtle, but meaningful. Support without dominance. Presence without interference. Educational value. Nonverbal positioning during sensitive discussions can reinforce emotional alignment without verbal escalation. Margaret opened the folder slowly. I assume this meeting concerns the governance framework, she said. Scarlett did not sit immediately. Instead, she walked toward the window briefly, glancing at the fountain below, before turning back toward the table. Yes, she said calmly, but not in the way you might expect. Margaret's eyes sharpened slightly, not defensively, but analytically. Scarlett took her toot. For a few seconds, no one spoke. And unlike previous silences, this one was not heavy. It was measured, intentional. I have reviewed the documents thoroughly, Scarlett began. Multiple times. Margaret nodded once. That is a responsible approach. Scarlett folded her hands gently on the table. They are well structured, she continued. Professionally written and strategically sound. Another nod from Margaret. Then Scarlett added, with quiet clarity, but they are also psychologically influential. The room grew still, not tense, attentive. Educational insight, emotionally intelligent confrontation focuses on impact rather than accusation. Margaret did not react defensively. Instead, she asked calmly, in what way? Scarlett met her gaze steadily. The structure introduces advisory checkpoints that, over time, would shape operational authority through influence rather than direct control. The precision of her language shifted the dynamic instantly. This was not an emotional objection. This was analytical awareness. Margaret closed the folder slowly. That is a sophisticated interpretation, she admitted. It is an accurate one, Scarlett replied. Harrison remained silent, observing carefully, not intervening, not redirecting, respecting Scarlett's leadership of the conversation. Educational value. Allowing a leader to speak for themselves reinforces authority more effectively than intervening on their behalf. Margaret leaned back slightly. My intention, she said calmly, was never to undermine your ownership. I understand that, Scarlett replied immediately. The response surprised Margaret more than resistance would have. Scarlett continued, I also understand that your concern is not ownership, but continuity. Margaret's expression shifted, subtly, but noticeably, because she had not expected such direct psychological accuracy. Yes, she said, after a moment. That is correct. Scarlett nodded. And continuity, from your perspective, requires structured influence during transitional leadership phases. Margaret studied her carefully. You have analyzed this deeply. I have, Scarlett said. A quiet pause followed. Then Scarlett leaned forward slightly. But I have also analyzed something else. Margaret did not interrupt. My own reactions, Scarlett continued. My own fears. And my own interpretation of structured caution. The honesty in that statement changed the emotional tone of the room. Educational life lesson. Self-awareness during conflict reduces defensiveness and increases mutual respect. For several weeks, Scarlett said calmly, I interpreted governance proposals as subtle attempts to reshape my authority. Margaret remained silent, listening carefully. But I now recognize, Scarlett added, that my interpretation was partially influenced by my past experiences with conditional stability. The admission was not weakness. It was leadership-level emotional intelligence. Margaret's posture softened, almost imperceptibly. That is a rare level of introspection, she said. Scarlett gave a small, composed nod. Your caution, Scarlett continued, is rooted in institutional responsibility. Yes, Margaret confirmed. And your structured proposals, Scarlett said, are designed to reduce perceived risk during sudden leadership transitions. Another quiet nod. The psychological alignment between them was becoming clearer with each sentence. Educational insight. Understanding the motivation behind someone's actions transforms confrontation into collaboration. Scarlett inhaled slowly. But there is a critical distinction I must establish. Margaret's attention sharpened fully now. I will not implement a governance structure that gradually redistributes practical authority through advisory influence, Scarlett said calmly. The statement was firm, but not emotional, not defensive, just clear. Silence filled the room. Harrison watched Margaret carefully, not tensely, but observantly. Margaret did not react immediately. Instead, she asked a question. Is that decision based on emotional resistance or strategic reasoning? Scarlett answered without hesitation. Strategic emotional reasoning. The phrase carried weight, educational value. Effective leadership decisions balance emotional awareness with strategic clarity. I recognize, Scarlett continued, that institutional stability is essential. Margaret listened. I recognize that my leadership is still in transition. Another pause. And I recognize, Scarlett added, that advisory insight can be valuable. Margaret's eyes narrowed slightly. Not critically, but thoughtfully. Then why reject the structure? She asked. Scarlett's voice remained calm. Because leadership credibility cannot develop authentically under the perception of layered oversight. The statement landed deeply, not as rebellion, but as leadership philosophy. Educational insight. Authentic leadership requires visible accountability, not concealed influence structures. Margaret leaned back slowly. You believe the structure would undermine your perceived authority? Yes, Scarlett replied, gradually, subtly, professionally. Another silence followed, but this one carried respect rather than tension. Harrison finally spoke, his voice calm and measured. She is not rejecting institutional stability, he said. She is rejecting premature structural influence. Margaret glanced at him briefly, then back at Scarlett. And how, Margaret asked, do you intend to ensure continuity without advisory governance? Scarlett answered without hesitation. Through transparent consultation rather than formalized influence. The clarity of that response shifted the atmosphere entirely. Educational life lesson. Consultation invites support. Structured influence implies oversight. I will seek advice, Scarlett continued. I will request historical insights. I will respect institutional traditions. She paused, but final operational authority must remain visibly aligned with ownership responsibility. Margaret remained silent for several seconds. Then, slowly, she closed the folder completely. The sound was soft, but symbolic. You speak, Margaret said quietly, with the same emotional stability my mother-in-law valued. Scarlett's expression softened slightly. She taught me that legacy is protected through wisdom, not control. Margaret studied her one last time, longer than before, more carefully, and then, for the first time since the inheritance, Margaret nodded without reservation. Very well, she said calmly. The weight of those two words filled the room. Not as surrender, not as defeat, but as acknowledgement. Educational insight, respect in leadership dynamics is earned through clarity, composure, and self-awareness, not force. Scarlett exhaled slowly, her shoulders relaxing just slightly. Not from victory, but from resolution. Because the confrontation had not been about winning authority. It had been about defining it with emotional intelligence and strategic clarity. The atmosphere in the hotel changed before any official announcement was made. Not dramatically, not publicly, but perceptibly. Scarlett noticed it first in the way senior staff spoke to her. Not with forced politeness, not with cautious hesitation, but with steady, professional alignment. The kind that signaled psychological acceptance rather than formal compliance. Educational insight. In leadership transitions, true authority is not established by titles alone, but by behavioral consistency over time. 3 days after the meeting with Margaret, no new governance documents arrived. No revised frameworks. No structured oversight proposals. No advisory mandates, disguised as recommendations. Instead, something far more meaningful occurred. Silence. But this silence was different from the earlier kind. This was institutional recalibration. Scarlett stood in the executive office that Eleanor had once occupied, reviewing operational reports with a level of focus that now felt grounded rather than defensive. The large windows overlooked the courtyard fountain, its steady rhythm no longer symbolic of pressure, but of continuity. She noticed a subtle shift in her own posture. Less rigid, less vigilant, more present. Educational value. When internal clarity is achieved, external pressure often feels less threatening, even when responsibilities remain the same. A gentle knock interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she said. The operations director entered, holding a tablet and a neatly organized file. "Good morning, Ms. Hayes," he said, respectfully. Scarlett nodded. "Good morning." He placed the file on the desk. "These are the updated staff, performance summaries, and guest experience reports." She scanned the documents briefly. "Any operational concerns?" she asked calmly. The director hesitated for a fraction of a second. "None significant," he replied. "In fact, staff morale has improved over the past week." Scarlett looked up. "Improved?" "Yes," he confirmed. "There is a perception of stable leadership direction." The phrasing was professional, but psychologically revealing. Educational insight. Organizations respond emotionally to leadership clarity, even more than structural directives. Scarlett nodded thoughtfully. "Thank you. That will be all." As the director exited, she leaned back slightly in her chair, absorbing the deeper implication of that statement. Stable leadership direction. Not authority enforcement. Not structural dominance. Stability. And that stability had not come from asserting control. It had come from defining boundaries calmly. Educational life lesson. Clear boundaries often establish stronger leadership credibility than aggressive decision-making. Later that afternoon, Scarlett walked through the main lobby without announcement. Not as a symbolic gesture, not as a performance, but as observation, just as Eleanor had once done. Guests moved naturally through the space. Staff greeted them with composed professionalism. Operations flowed with the same elegance the hotel had maintained for decades. Yet something subtle had shifted. Staff interactions felt less cautious around her, more natural, more aligned. Educational insight. When leaders act with emotional consistency, teams gradually shift from uncertainty to trust. She paused near the front desk, the very place where she had once worked late-night shifts years ago. The memory surfaced gently, not painfully, not nostalgically, just reflectively. "You used to stand right there," a familiar voice said calmly behind her. Scarlett turned. Harrison. He stood a few steps away, observing the lobby with the same composed attentiveness that had defined him since the night they first met. "Yes," she replied softly, And you organized the reservation files, even when they were already aligned, he added. A faint smile touched her lips. Some habits take time to evolve. Educational value. Personal growth rarely eliminates habits instantly. It refines their purpose over time. They stood side by side, watching the quiet rhythm of the hotel. You handled the meeting with my mother exceptionally well, Harrison said. Scarlett exhaled slowly. I handled it with clarity. He nodded. Clarity under pressure is a rare leadership trait. She glanced at him. I wasn't trying to assert authority, she admitted. I was defining it. That distinction mattered deeply. Educational insight. Defining authority is more sustainable than asserting dominance in leadership environments. Harrison leaned lightly against a nearby column. She respects you now, he said. Scarlett looked toward the upper floors briefly. I believe she respects the stability of my decisions and the emotional composure behind them, he added. Another quiet moment passed. Then Harrison spoke again. You set a boundary without rejecting institutional wisdom. Scarlett considered that carefully. I realized something after our conversation, she said. What? He asked. That boundaries are not resistance, she replied. They are structural clarity. The statement lingered between them. Simple, accurate, grounded. Educational life lesson. Healthy boundaries in leadership and relationships prevent long-term resentment and confusion. They walked slowly toward the courtyard doors, the sound of the fountain growing louder as they approached. For weeks, Scarlett continued, I was preparing myself to defend my independence. Harrison listened quietly. But true independence, she added, does not require defensive posture. It requires internal certainty. He nodded slowly. That is emotional maturity. Scarlett rested her hand lightly on the glass door handle, but did not open it yet. There is something else I've learned, she said. Harrison waited. Power, she continued softly, is not proven by control. A pause. It is proven by stability under observation. The words reflected Eleanor's philosophy more than she realized. Educational insight. Sustainable leadership is measured by composure under scrutiny, not authority under pressure. Outside, the fountain continued its steady rhythm, unchanged by internal leadership transitions. Scarlett finally stepped into the courtyard, the cool air grounding her thoughts further. When I first inherited the hotel, she said, I felt exposed. Harrison joined her. And now? He asked. She looked at the water carefully. Responsible, she replied. Not overwhelmed, not defensive, not uncertain. Responsible. Educational value. Reframing responsibility from burden to purpose transforms leadership mindset. Harrison studied her expression. You're no longer reacting to the inheritance, he observed. No, she said calmly. I'm integrating it. That single word carried profound psychological growth. Integration meant acceptance without loss of identity. Acceptance without surrender of autonomy. Acceptance without emotional isolation. I also realized something about your mother, Scarlett added. Harrison's attention sharpened slightly. She was not trying to take authority, Scarlett continued. She was trying to protect institutional continuity in the only way she had been conditioned to. Harrison exhaled quietly. That is accurate. Educational insight, understanding the motivation behind perceived opposition, reduces emotional conflict and increases strategic cooperation. Scarlett turned toward him. That understanding changed my reaction. In what way? He asked. I stopped interpreting caution as control, she said. Another silence followed. But this one felt calm, balanced. Grounded, for the first time, Harrison said quietly. The hotel feels aligned with both legacy and emotional stability. Scarlett looked back at the building, towering above them. Marble, glass, history, responsibility, and yet, for the first time since the inheritance, it no longer felt like something fragile she had to defend. It felt like something she could lead, with clarity, boundaries, and emotional wisdom. Educational life lesson. True leadership begins when fear of losing control is replaced by confidence in maintaining stability. As the fountain continued its steady flow, Scarlett realized something profoundly important. She had not needed to fight for authority. She had needed to understand it, define it, and embody it calmly. And in doing so, she had not only secured her leadership position, she had begun reshaping the emotional culture of the legacy she now carried. The invitation from Margaret came 3 days later, not through a formal email, not through a legal assistant, but through a brief handwritten note delivered to Scarlett's office. Dinner, private, no advisors. Margaret Scarlett read it twice, not because the message was unclear, but because the method was handwritten, personal, direct. Educational insight. When highly structured individuals shift from formal to personal communication, it often signals a transition from strategic interaction to relational engagement. That evening, the private dining room, overlooking the courtyard, was set with quiet elegance. Soft lighting reflected against the polished table, and the steady sound of the fountain filtered through the partially opened glass doors. Margaret was already seated when Scarlett entered. No documents, no folders, no prepared files, only a simple place setting and a composed posture that felt noticeably different from their previous meetings. "Good evening, Scarlett," Margaret said calmly. "Good evening," Scarlett replied. They sat across from each other, the atmosphere not tense, but contemplative. For a moment, neither spoke, and unlike their earlier silences, this one carried no strategic weight, only reflection, educational value. Not all silence in conversations indicates tension. Sometimes it reflects mutual emotional processing. Margaret folded her hands lightly. "I have been observing you," she said. Scarlett did not react defensively. Instead, she nodded. "I assumed as much." A faint, almost approving expression crossed Margaret's face. "That assumption demonstrates awareness rather than insecurity," she said. Scarlett remained calm. "What have you observed?" she asked. Margaret did not answer immediately. She glanced briefly toward the courtyard fountain, as if organizing her thoughts with the same measured precision she applied to institutional decisions. "You did not react impulsively to the inheritance," Margaret began. "You did not sign governance documents under pressure. You did not confront me emotionally when structured influence was proposed." She paused. "Instead, you analyzed." Scarlett listened quietly, and then, Margaret continued, "You confronted the situation with clarity rather than defensiveness. The acknowledgement was subtle, but significant. Educational insight. Leaders earn long-term respect when they respond to pressure with composure rather than reaction." Scarlett exhaled softly. "I confronted my own interpretations first," she said. Margaret's gaze sharpened slightly. "Yes," she replied, "and that is precisely what my mother-in-law valued most in leadership." The mention of Eleanor shifted the emotional tone gently. "Not heavy, not sorrowful, but respectful." Margaret leaned back slightly in her chair. "You must understand something about our family," she said. Scarlett nodded. "Dow, I am listening." Margaret's voice remained calm, but more personal than before. For 4 generations, the Ashford Grand has never left direct family governance. The statement was factual, not accusatory. Scarlett absorbed it fully. "And when the will was read," Margaret continued, "my first reaction was not anger." Scarlett waited, It was institutional concern. That distinction mattered deeply. Educational life lesson. Initial resistance to change is often rooted in fear of instability, rather than personal opposition. I questioned the decision, Margaret admitted. Not because I doubted your character, but because sudden leadership transitions historically introduce operational risk. Scarlett responded quietly. That is a rational concern. Margaret's eyes softened slightly. Yes, it is. Another pause followed. Then Margaret spoke again, more slowly. But over the past weeks, something became evident. Scarlett remained still. You do not lead from ego, Margaret said. You lead from reflection. The statement carried weight because it was not praise. It was evaluation, now evolving into acknowledgement. Educational insight. Reflective leadership fosters trust more effectively than authority-driven leadership. Scarlett folded her hands gently on the table. I was afraid of something, she admitted calmly. Margaret tilted her head slightly. What? That the inheritance would alter how I was perceived, Scarlett replied. As a wife, as a leader, and as someone suddenly placed in a position of institutional significance. Margaret studied her carefully. That fear is psychologically accurate, she said. Scarlett blinked slightly. You expected it, she asked. Yes, Margaret replied, without hesitation. Sudden elevation in authority often creates both internal self-evaluation and external scrutiny. Educational value. Rapid changes in status frequently trigger identity recalibration and heightened self-awareness. Scarlett glanced briefly at the fountain outside. For weeks, she said softly, I interpreted structured caution as potential control. Margaret did not deny it. That interpretation was understandable, she said. The honesty in her tone carried no defensiveness, only realism. But my intention, Margaret continued, was never to take authority from you. Scarlett met her gaze. I know that now. Margaret's posture relaxed slightly, for the first time since the inheritance. My concern, she clarified, was whether emotional stability would be maintained under sudden responsibility. Scarlett nodded slowly. That aligns with your questions during our previous meetings. Margaret allowed a small, measured smile. You were being evaluated. The directness no longer felt threatening. It felt transparent. Educational insight, transparent acknowledgement of evaluation reduces psychological tension and builds mutual trust. And what is your evaluation now? Scarlett asked calmly. Margaret paused longer this time, then answered with deliberate clarity. You are not emotionally reactive under pressure. A beat, of silence. You establish boundaries without hostility. Another pause. And you prioritize institutional stability without surrendering personal authority. The words settled deeply into the room, not as validation alone, but as earned respect. Scarlett exhaled slowly. I learned something important during this process, she said. Margaret listened. That legacy is not protected by control, Scarlett continued. It is protected by emotionally consistent leadership. Margaret's expression changed subtly, not dramatically, but meaningfully. That, she said quietly, was my mother-in-law's philosophy. Scarlett gave a small nod. She taught it through observation rather than instruction. Another silence followed, but this time it felt warm rather than analytical. Margaret glanced toward the window again. For the first time since the will was read, she said, I am not concerned about the hotel's continuity. Scarlett's breath slowed slightly. Because of structural decisions? She asked. No, Margaret replied. Because of behavioral consistency. Educational life lesson. Long-term trust is built through consistent behavior, not single decisions. Margaret folded her hands once more. I will not propose further governance structures, she said calmly. The sentence carried profound resolution, not as surrender, but as recognition. However, she added, I remain available for consultation when requested. Scarlett nodded. That is a structure I value. Consultation, not influence, not oversight. Mutual respect. Margaret's voice softened slightly. You have redefined the leadership transition without conflict. Scarlett allowed a faint, thoughtful smile. I chose clarity over resistance, and emotional intelligence over defensiveness, Margaret added. The fountain continued its steady rhythm outside, unchanged, consistent, enduring, and as the evening light dimmed across the private dining room, the dynamic between them shifted fully, not into authority and opposition, but into something far more stable. Mutual respect grounded in emotional maturity, institutional understanding, and the quiet realization that legacy could be preserved not through control, but through trust in the one person Eleanor had observed long enough to choose. The first Sunday after everything settled felt almost ordinary, and that, more than anything, surprised Scarlett. Morning light entered the penthouse kitchen in soft, gradual layers, illuminating the marble countertop where her hand instinctively moved with the same familiar routine. She picked up the dishcloth, wiped the corner of the counter once, and paused. Only once, not twice, not out of habit, but out of awareness. Educational insight, healing, and emotional growth often appear first in small behavioral shifts, not dramatic life changes. She rested her fingers lightly on the surface where letters had once been placed years ago. Bills, notes, reminders, fragments of a life where stability always felt conditional. Now, the space was empty. And for the first time, the emptiness did not feel like anticipation. It felt like peace. Behind her, the soft sound of coffee brewing filled the quiet kitchen, followed by the gentle footsteps she had come to recognize without needing to turn. You didn't check the counter twice, Harrison said calmly. Scarlett allowed a small, reflective smile before facing him. I noticed. He leaned lightly against the doorway, observing her not with analysis, not with concern, but with the same steady attentiveness that had defined their relationship since the night they first met at the front desk years ago. Not admiration, not performance, recognition. Educational value. Long-term emotional bonds deepen through consistent recognition rather than dramatic gestures. The city outside moved as it always did. Cars passing, guests arriving, staff beginning their shifts. But internally, something fundamental had shifted within Scarlett. Not her responsibilities, not her authority, but her interpretation of both. She poured coffee into 2 cups and handed one to Harrison. For weeks, she said quietly, I believed I was defending something fragile. He accepted the cup. The hotel? He asked. She shook her head gently. My sense of self, the honesty, felt grounding rather than heavy. Educational life lesson. When individuals face sudden life changes, the true fear is often identity destabilization rather than external loss. Harrison nodded slowly. That makes sense. Scarlett walked toward the window, overlooking the courtyard. The fountain continued its steady rhythm below, unchanged by legal transitions, emotional conversations, or institutional recalibrations. Consistent, stable, enduring, just as Eleanor had intended the hotel to be. I misunderstood something important, Scarlett continued softly. Harrison remained silent, allowing her to articulate fully. I thought leadership required emotional isolation, she said. He tilted his head slightly. Now, she exhaled slowly. Now I understand that emotional isolation weakens leadership clarity. Educational insight. Isolation under responsibility increases internal pressure and reduces decision confidence. Harrison stepped closer, but not abruptly. You carried the transition internally, he observed. Yes, she admitted. I analyzed every document, every conversation, every silence. She paused, and in doing so, I created psychological distance where support already existed. The realization was calm, not regretful, just air. Educational value over analysis during high-pressure transitions can unintentionally create emotional separation from support systems. Harrison rested his coffee cup on the counter. I also misunderstood something, he said. Scarlett turned slightly. What? I believed restraint was the most respectful way to support your independence, he replied. She studied his expression carefully. And it wasn't. It was partially correct, he said, but incomplete. That distinction lingered. Educational insight. Support requires both respect for autonomy and visible emotional presence. Scarlett leaned lightly against the window frame. For weeks, she said, I interpreted restraint as emotional distance, and I interpreted your composure as self-sufficiency, he added. They both fell silent for a moment, not out of tension, but recognition, because the pattern was now fully visible. Two emotionally aware individuals, both acting with care, both misinterpreting silence through the lens of internal pressure. Educational life lesson. Even emotionally intelligent relationships require explicit communication during major life transitions. Scarlett glanced down at the courtyard again. When your grandmother chose me, she said softly, I believed I had been given something fragile that needed protection. Harrison followed her gaze. Now? He asked. She thought carefully before answering. Now I believe I was entrusted with something stable that needed understanding. The shift in wording reflected a deeper psychological transformation. From fear-based protection to clarity-based leadership. Educational insight, reframing responsibility from fragility to stability, reduces anxiety and improves long-term decision-making. A quiet knock sounded at the door. Scarlett opened it to find the operations director standing respectfully. Good morning, Ms. Hayes, he said. I wanted to inform you that guest satisfaction metrics have reached their highest levels this quarter. Scarlett blinked slightly. That is good to hear. He hesitated briefly. There is also a noticeable improvement in staff confidence, he added. Scarlett's expression softened. In what way? The director answered carefully. There is a perception of emotionally stable leadership during the transition period. The phrasing was professional, but deeply meaningful. Educational value. Teams respond more strongly to emotional stability in leadership than to structural authority alone. Thank you, Scarlett said, calmly. As the director left, she closed the door gently and returned to the window. For the first time, she said quietly, I don't feel observed. Harrison looked at her. You are still being observed, he said, honestly, by staff, by advisors, by the institution itself. She nodded. Yes, a pause, but I no longer feel evaluated. That distinction was profound. Educational insight. Confidence in leadership emerges when internal self-evaluation stabilizes, regardless of external observation. Scarlett set her cup down slowly. I also understand your mother differently now. Harrison's attention sharpened slightly. In what way? She was never trying to take anything from me, Scarlett replied. She was trying to protect continuity, using the only framework she trusted, structure. He exhaled quietly. That is accurate. And I, Scarlett added, was interpreting structure through the lens of past instability. The clarity in her voice reflected genuine, emotional integration. Not defensive reinterpretation. Not forced forgiveness. Understanding. Educational life lesson. Past experiences shape present interpretations, but awareness allows those interpretations to evolve. The morning light brightened slightly as the sun rose higher over the city skyline. Scarlett reached for the dishcloth again, not out of habit, but out of quiet intention, and gently folded it beside the sink. Then she stopped, left it there, touched. For the first time in years, she did not feel the urge to recheck the same corner of the counter. Not because her past had disappeared, but because her perception of stability had changed. And that change did not come from legal ownership, institutional respect, or external validation. It came from understanding that trust, when clarified through honest communication and emotional maturity, is far more stable than fear shaped by memory. Weeks passed without incident. No new legal proposals. No strategic interventions. No carefully worded documents, disguised as protective structures. The Ashford Grand continued its quiet rhythm, functioning with the same elegance it had maintained for generations. Guests arrived. Conversations unfolded in soft tones across the lobby, and the fountain in the courtyard flowed with its steady, familiar cadence. On the surface, nothing dramatic had changed. But internally, everything had. Not in a way that could be announced. Not in a way that required validation, but in a way that reshaped how Scarlett experienced responsibility, trust, and love. Educational insight. The most meaningful emotional resolutions are rarely dramatic. They are integrated quietly into daily behavior and perception. One late afternoon, Scarlett walked through the lobby alone, not as a symbolic act of leadership, but as a habit of observation she had unconsciously inherited from Eleanor. Staff interactions felt natural now. Conversations did not pause when she approached. Decisions were presented to her with clarity, not caution. Not because her authority had increased, but because her emotional consistency had stabilized. Educational value, consistent emotional presence in leadership gradually replaces uncertainty with trust across organizations and relationships. She paused near the front desk, the exact spot where years ago she had worked late-night shifts, aligning documents that were already aligned, organizing files that did not need organizing, small acts of control in a life that once felt emotionally unpredictable. Her fingers brushed lightly across the polished surface, and for the first time, the memory did not feel distant. It felt integrated. Behind her, Harrison's voice came softly. "You still observe the same details." She turned slightly, a calm smile touching her expression. "I understand them differently now." He stood beside her, his posture relaxed, in a way it had not been during the weeks immediately following the inheritance. Nod, cautious, not restrained. Present, educational life lesson. Understanding transforms behavior more effectively than forced change. They stood in silence for a moment, watching the quiet movement of guests and staff. "Do you remember the first night we met?" Harrison asked. Scarlett nodded slowly. "You said I looked like someone who listens more than she speaks," she replied. He gave a faint, thoughtful smile. "And you were organizing files that were already in perfect order." She exhaled softly. "I wasn't organizing the files," she admitted. "I was stabilizing myself." The honesty no longer felt heavy. It felt peaceful. Educational insight. Many routine behaviors are subconscious emotional regulation strategies developed during periods of instability. Harrison leaned lightly against the desk. "When my grandmother chose you," he said, "I didn't fully understand why." Scarlett turned toward him. Now?" "I do," he replied. A pause followed. "She didn't choose you because you were flawless," he continued. "She chose you because you were emotionally consistent under quiet pressure." The words lingered, not as praise, but as recognition. Scarlett's gaze softened slightly. "I was afraid in the beginning," she admitted. Of the hotel? He asked gently. She shook her head. Of what it would change. He nodded slowly. That is a rational fear. Yes, she said. I thought sudden responsibility would change how people trusted me. And how I trusted them. Educational value. Rapid life changes often trigger fear of relational shifts more than fear of the change itself. They began walking slowly toward the courtyard doors, the soft sound of the fountain growing clearer as they stepped outside. Cool air met them gently. Grounding, calm. Scarlett watched the water flow for a moment before speaking again. For a while, she said, I believed your silence meant emotional distance. Harrison did not interrupt. And I believed your composure meant self-sufficiency, he replied. They exchanged a quiet look of mutual understanding, because now neither interpretation felt threatening. Only human. Educational insight, misinterpretation in relationships is often rooted in protective instincts, not emotional neglect. Scarlett folded her hands lightly. I also misunderstood your mother, she said. Harrison's expression remained calm. In what way? I thought she was trying to reshape my life, Scarlett replied. But she was trying to protect continuity, the only way she had been conditioned to. He exhaled quietly. That realization took time for all of us. Yes, she agreed. A longer silence followed. But this one was not filled with uncertainty. It was reflective, grounded, resolved. For the first time, Scarlett continued softly, I no longer feel like the hotel is something I must defend. Harrison looked at her carefully. And what does it feel like now? She considered the question thoughtfully. Something I am responsible for, she said. Not something I am threatened by. The distinction carried profound emotional maturity. Educational life lesson. Responsibility becomes sustainable when it is no longer driven by fear of loss, but by clarity of purpose. The fountain continued its steady rhythm, unchanged, consistent, during just as it had been on the day the will was read, just as it had been during every quiet conversation, every internal doubt, every misinterpreted silence. Scarlett smiled faintly. There is one more thing I've learned, she said. Harrison tilted his head slightly. What? That memory is not always inaccurate, she replied, but it is often incomplete. He listened closely. I remembered the will reading as a moment of silent opposition, she continued, when in reality, it was a moment of silent processing. Another pause. I remembered structured caution as an attempt to control me, she added, when it was actually an attempt to protect continuity. Educational insight. Emotional memory often reshapes events based on fear rather than full context. Harrison's voice softened. And how do you remember it now? Scarlett looked back at the hotel rising behind them. Marble, glass, history, and quiet legacy woven into its structure. I remember it as a transition, she said calmly. Not a threat. The simplicity of that sentence marked the completion of a long internal journey. They returned to the penthouse as evening light filled the space in warm tones. Scarlett walked into the kitchen, picked up the dishcloth, and wiped the corner of the counter once. Then she stopped, not because the habit had vanished, but because the meaning behind it had changed. She placed the cloth beside the sink and left it there without hesitation. Harrison watched quietly. You didn't pause, he observed. Scarlett shook her head gently. I don't expect invisible letters anymore. The words were soft, but deeply symbolic. Educational moral reflection. When individuals stop anticipating emotional loss, their behaviors naturally shift toward stability and presence. She rested her hands lightly on the countertop, and looked out toward the courtyard one last time. The hotel was never the fragile thing, she said quietly. My perception of stability was. Harrison stepped closer, not dramatically, not urgently, just present. And now? He asked. She exhaled slowly, a calm sense of clarity settling into her voice. Now I understand that trust is not proven through control, silence, or strategic positioning, she said. It is built through consistent understanding, honest communication, and emotional patience. The room grew quiet again, but not with tension, not with uncertainty, with peace. Not perfect peace, not idealized resolution, but realistic, emotional clarity. And for the first time since inheriting a $500 million legacy, Scarlett did not feel like someone who had been given something overwhelming, fragile, or conditional. She felt like someone who had grown into the responsibility, not by fighting for authority, not by isolating herself emotionally, and not by proving strength through resistance, but by understanding that love, trust, and leadership all share the same quiet foundation. They endure not through control or fear, but through clarity, consistency, and the courage to reinterpret memories that once shaped how we protect what matters most. Before we close this story, take a quiet moment and ask yourself something honestly. Was Scarlett ever truly in danger of losing everything? Or was she slowly realizing that fear, memory, and silence were shaping how she interpreted love and trust? Share your answer in the comments, fear or misunderstanding, and explain why. Because the deepest life lesson in this story is simple but powerful. Not every conflict in relationships comes from betrayal. Sometimes it comes from unspoken emotions, past experiences, and the way we interpret silence. If this story gave you insight about love, emotional intelligence, trust, and personal growth, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to Love Stories by Mr. Deb Johnson, and turn on notifications for more meaningful love stories that don't just entertain, but teach real-life lessons that stay with you long after the story ends.